It began with a silence no one wanted to acknowledge, a numb patch of skin that did not flinch beneath the cold. In Victorian London, that tiny loss of feeling was enough to freeze an entire household with dread. Mothers hid their children, physicians arrived after dark, and neighbors pressed themselves against the wallpaper, praying the rumors drifting through the coal smoke were not true. Because nothing terrified London more than this disease, the ancient horror that crept without pain, marked its victims slowly, and carried a stigma so powerful it could banish a person from the living long before death ever came. Before we descend further into these fog-choked streets, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Stay close, this tale is best followed with the lights low and your breath held. Now step with me into a city where a single pale spot could end a life, not by killing the body, but by erasing the person. The first sign arrived quietly, without ceremony, like a letter slipped beneath a door at dusk. On a morning so bitter that frost clung to the window panes like white lace, Eleanor Price dipped her hands into a basin of icy water to begin the day's washing. The tenement corridor outside her room hummed faintly with footsteps, pipe smoke, and the muffled groans of early risers, preparing for another London day. Yet within her small rented room, time seemed to hesitate, stalled by something so slight she almost dismissed it altogether. Her left hand felt nothing, not the sting of the cold water, not the bite of the soap, not the pain that should have come when she scraped her knuckles against the basin's edge. She paused, fingers suspended above the suds, pale and oddly still. Her breath clouded the air as she lifted her hand toward the thin light filtering through the window. The skin looked normal enough at first glance, perhaps a shade too pale, perhaps a touch too smooth. But when she pressed the pad of her thumb against that faint whitish blotch near the center of her knuckles, the sensation was eerily absent. It was as though her fingertip touched someone else's flesh, not her own. Eleanor frowned, rubbing the patch with a linen cloth, then with the edge of her nail, hoping to rouse the nerves beneath. Nothing, just the strange, hollow neutrality of a hand that did not quite belong to her anymore. In another time or city, she might have laughed it off as exhaustion or winter's cruelty. But this was Victorian London, a place where sickness did not simply sicken, it ruined. A place where walls were thin, rumors thick, and the boundary between illness and exile was perilously narrow. Eleanor had watched neighbors vanish, with only a whisper left behind. She remembered how Mrs. Hanson, 3 floors down, had gone missing after a suspicious rash, leaving her sewing machine abandoned mid-stitch, and how 2 boys in the adjoining building were suddenly said to have relocated, though their mother still set out plates for them every evening. Fear moved as stealthily as infection here. A knock sounded in the corridor, sharp, official, unwelcome. Eleanor's heart tightened. She wrapped a scarf hastily around her hand, though she knew no one could possibly have seen the patch yet. Still, she felt exposed, as if the mark were glowing through wool and shadow alike. Voices drifted past her door, the landlord's low muttering, a constable's clipped replies, the rustle of papers folded and refolded. She held her breath until the footsteps retreated. Only then did she return to the basin, though even the water confessed something ominous, where moments before she had plunged both hands into its frozen depth. Now the surface trembled faintly from the shiver she tried to suppress. She lowered her hand again, slowly, carefully, and when the cold wrapped around her skin like a chain, she felt absolutely nothing. The absence was louder than pain. The city outside awakened fully now. Carriage wheels on wet cobblestones, church bells struggling through the smoke-heavy air, the faint cry of a newspaper boy announcing stories that never told the whole truth. Eleanor stood motionless in the dim quiet of her room, listening to London rise around her. Each sound pressed closer, tinged with a new and dreadful weight. For somewhere deep beneath her skin, a horror older than the city itself had begun to stir, soft, numb, and patient. And London, though it did not yet know her name, would soon come to fear her, as it feared all those touched by the pale and merciless mark. Night settled over Whitechapel like a damp woolen cloak, pressing itself into the narrow streets and dim courtyards where London's poorest sought warmth in the glow of sputtering gas lamps. These lamps, always reluctant to burn steadily, shivered in the winter haze, as if struggling against the very rumours they illuminated. For that evening, it was not the usual gossip of wages, rent, or drunken quarrels drifting through the smoky tavern doorways. It was something far softer, far more dangerous. A whisper about a woman who washed linens by the yard and had been seen clutching her hand as though it no longer belonged to her. At first, only 2 men spoke of it, a factory porter and a lamplighter, both sheltering beneath the awning of the Green Hare public house. The porter, red-cheeked and suspicious of everything except ale, leaned in close and muttered, "There's talk of a mark pale as candle wax and cold as morning frost. Spreads quiet, it does. Doesn't hurt at all, that's how you know." The lamplighter, whose work forced him into every forgotten corner of the district, nodded grimly. He had seen too much darkness to doubt anything that crept silently. The wind carried their murmurs farther than either man imagined, past the tavern door, past the butcher's stall, where a thin sheet of ice coated the counter, past the cramped lodging houses where one cough could empty a building. Each retelling twisted the story slightly. A rash, someone said. A numbness, said another. A sickness that makes your skin forget you're alive, whispered a third. By the time the rumour reached Dorset Street, the tale had become a full-fledged haunting. No one spoke Eleanor Price's name. Such details were never needed. A face, a room number, a loose description, these were the ingredients of dread in a city that had learned to fear shadows more than sickness itself. The gas lamps flickered again, their light billowing through the fog like lanterns carried by nervous hands. A woman selling matches under the eaves of a boarded-up shop overheard 2 constables discussing the matter in brittle, clipped tones. "Public health is watching Whitechapel closely," one said. "Too many signs cropping up in the last month alone," his partner replied with a shudder. "If it's that disease, the old one, there'll be removals again, quiet ones." Before dawn, the match seller froze in place, as though the frost beneath her boots had climbed into her bones. She remembered a girl from her childhood parish who had vanished after whispers, much like these. Her mother had said it was for the best that some infections were worse than death, because the living paid the price long after the fever cooled. At the far end of the street, beneath a lamp haloed in yellow mist, an elderly man stood reading aloud from a folded newspaper. His voice trembled as he recited a small notice buried near the bottom of the page. "A case of suspected leprotic affliction has been reported within the East End district. Authorities advise vigilance." He swallowed hard before adding, "They say it begins with the skin forgetting how to feel." A silence followed, thick, smoky, crushing, the kind that suggests everyone has imagined the same dreadful possibility. Yet not all ears under the gas lamps belong to the fearful. A city inspector, coat buttoned to the throat, paused in the shadow of a warehouse doorway. He listened intently, notebook hidden beneath his sleeve. Each whisper sharpened his gaze. His orders were clear. Find the source before the rumour became an outbreak, before panic fed on itself like fire in a crowded theatre. But disease moved with a cunning that London never truly understood. It slipped through walls, rode on cloth, hid in silence. And the woman at the centre of these whispers, Eleanor Price, was still in her narrow room, staring at a hand that would not feel cold. As the gas lamps hissed softly overhead, Whitechapel braced itself for the next whisper, the kind that carried not curiosity, but warning. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had practiced medicine in London long enough to recognize the delicate balance between truth and terror. His surgery, tucked between a pawnbroker's shop and a bakery perpetually dusted in flour, wore the same weary expression as its owner, clean, orderly, but haunted by the illnesses it had witnessed. The brass plate on his door gleamed only in the hours before dawn, when the fog had not yet risen to smear it with soot. By evening, it dulled to the same grey pallor that clung to every surface in Whitechapel. It was on one such evening, when the clouds hung low and the air tasted faintly of coal and cold iron, that Eleanor Price stood uncertainly in his doorway. She held her shawl close, fingers trembling not from the chill but from the unbearable possibility of what she might learn inside. "Come in, Miss Price," Dr. Harrow murmured, though he had never treated her before. Her name had reached him through the quiet, winding channels of neighborhood gossip that arrived not with urgency, but with dread. He gestured toward a wooden chair worn smooth by the sick and the desperate. She sat, careful to keep her left hand hidden beneath her scarf. The doctor noticed immediately. He always noticed, with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who understood the weight of each gesture. Dr. Harrow lit a new oil lamp on the desk. Its flame flared, then steadied, casting a dim, amber glow over the room. Shadows stretched long across the floorboards, reaching like dark fingers toward Eleanor's bundled hand. "How long have you felt discomfort?" he asked gently. Eleanor hesitated. "There is no discomfort, sir. That is the trouble." She unwrapped the scarf. Dr. Harrow's breath did not catch. He had trained himself too well for that, but something within him tightened, invisible yet unmistakable. He leaned forward, inspecting the pale patch that sprawled across the knuckles like frost creeping over glass. When he pressed gently upon it with a small ivory tool, Eleanor watched his expression instead of her own hand. She felt nothing. He felt everything. The doctor's eyes lowered, not in shame, but in sorrow. The kind of sorrow that visits a man who must speak truths that destroy. "Miss Price," he began, voice softened almost to a whisper, "I would ask whether you injured the hand or exposed it to certain chemicals, but I believe you already know the answer." A tremor passed through her, subtle as a shift in the fog. "Is it the same sickness they whisper about in the streets?" Dr. Harrow closed his ledger, as though the act might shield her from the words he could no longer avoid. "There are signs," he admitted. "Signs that merit caution. Numbness, loss of temperature sensation, a certain pallor." He paused, searching her face for the strength he hoped she possessed. "I cannot confirm it fully, not yet, but I must notify the health board. They will expect a formal examination." Eleanor's heart seemed to shrink upon itself. She thought of the removal wagons at dawn, the sealed letters, the people who vanished, with only a rented room left behind to explain their absence. "Will they take me away?" she whispered. Dr. Harrow lowered his eyes again. The lamplight flickered, catching the sheen of fatigue in the creases around them. "Their duty is to protect the city. Mine is to protect you." After a breath, he added, "But I cannot shield you from everything, Miss Price, nor can the truth remain hidden." The clock on the wall ticked softly, like a heartbeat in a sick room. Eleanor stared at her hand as though it belonged to another woman entirely, a woman whose future had narrowed to the width of a pale, senseless patch. The doctor rose, walked to the window, and drew the curtains shut. Outside, the gas lamps hissed in the fog, carrying the whispers of London's fear from street to street. "Rest tonight," he said without turning. "Tomorrow, we will face what must be faced." But Eleanor knew, as did the doctor, though he did not speak it, that the moment he lowered his eyes, her life had already begun to slip beyond her grasp. And somewhere in the city, another whisper took shape. The examination room smelled faintly of starch, carbolic, and the chilled metal of instruments laid out with clinical precision. It was a room meant for certainty, for clean diagnoses, neat signatures, and tidy conclusions. Yet as Eleanor sat upon the narrow wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap like disobedient schoolchildren, certainty seemed the one thing most absent. The window panes, frosted with January breath, allowed no warmth inside. London's distant noises, carts, bells, footsteps sinking into slush felt muffled, as if the city had drawn a curtain between her and whatever fate lay beyond this moment. Dr. Harrow moved quietly, as though any abrupt sound might break the fragile composure she had managed to keep. He selected his tools with a ritualistic solemnity: a thin steel needle, a small vial of spirit, a folded square of bleached linen. Each item gleamed in the lamplight like a promise she did not wish to hear. "We will begin with a simple sensation test," he said gently, though the words felt heavy, preordained. "Tell me when you feel the prick." Eleanor extended her left hand, fingers trembling. The numb patch glowed ghost-like against her skin, an island of unnatural stillness. For a fleeting moment, she prayed the doctor had been mistaken, that nerves might suddenly awaken, that the cold she had felt the night before would return. The needle touched her knuckle. She felt nothing. A breath left her, not a gasp, not a sob, simply a quiet collapse of hope. Dr. Harrow did not react, but she saw the truth in the slow exhale he tried to hide behind the mask of professionalism. He pressed deeper. Not enough to draw blood, but enough that she should have flinched, should have cried out, should have recoiled. Still nothing. "It may be temporary," she whispered, the words trembling like loose threads. A chill, a nerve frozen by the cold. But the doctor shook his head. He continued the examination with aching thoroughness, tracing a line of pressure along her forearm, testing warmth, cold, vibration. Each test yielded the same quiet horror, a boundary where sensation simply ceased, a cliff edge between the living and the unfeeling. Eleanor stared at her hand as though the skin might confess its betrayal. Instead, it lay motionless upon the linen, pale, obedient, and frighteningly foreign. Dr. Harrow finally stepped back. He placed the needle upon the tray with a soft metallic click that echoed louder in Eleanor's mind than any shout. "I must file a preliminary report," he said, voice lowered to a near whisper. "Your case will be reviewed. There will be procedures." "Procedures," she repeated, tasting the word as though it were something spoiled. "It is essential," he continued, "that you avoid unnecessary contact with your neighbors, for your own safety and theirs." Safety. The word rang hollow. The city did not safeguard women like Eleanor, it removed them, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Between them, the lamplight swayed slightly, causing their shadows to shudder across the walls, like two figures caught in a procession no one wished to join. "Is it truly that sickness?" she asked at last. Her voice trembled with the kind of fear that does not rise suddenly but roots itself deep, like mildew in old plaster. Dr. Harrow hesitated, and in that hesitation she found the answer she had dreaded. "The signs are concerning," he admitted, "but nothing is final until the board has examined you." The board, a faceless circle of men who would decide whether she remained within London's teeming life or slipped into the silent outskirts where the afflicted were kept. Eleanor gathered her shawl and rose, feeling the faintest tremor in her knees. Not from pain, for there was none, but from the weight of the future pressing upon her narrow shoulders. As she stepped toward the doorway, the doctor called softly, "Miss Price." She paused. "Should the board request you tomorrow morning, be ready." His eyes glistened with a sympathy that felt too late. "And do not walk home alone." Outside, the fog thickened, curling beneath the gas lamps like a living thing. Eleanor pulled her shawl tight, but the cold that seeped into her bones came not from winter's bite. It came from the memory of a needle that had drawn no pain. London, she realized, would never feel the same again. By the time Eleanor returned to her building on Whitechapel Row, dusk had deepened into that murky, uncertain hour when London seemed to hold its breath. The fog rolled in thick bands along the cobblestones, softening the sharpness of footsteps, swallowing whole the cries of street hawkers, and muffling the rattle of distant carriages. Even the gas lamps flickered more cautiously, as though unwilling to shine too brightly on what the night carried. Eleanor approached her tenement door with her shawl pulled close, her left hand hidden deep within its folds. She kept her eyes down, not wishing to invite conversation, but even without looking, she felt them. The stares that pricked more sharply than any needle, the shift of silhouettes behind thin, yellowed curtains. The residents of Whitechapel Row were not known for their charity, but they possessed a talent far more potent: observation. A cough in the middle of the night, a missed shift at the factory, a small parcel delivered by a stranger, everything was noticed, catalogued, whispered about. And now, Eleanor Price had become the newest entry in their private ledgers of suspicion. Mrs. Alder, who lived one floor up and spent most evenings stationed at her window as if paid by the constabulary to watch the street, paused mid-curtain twitch as Eleanor passed beneath. Her eyes followed every step, narrowing not in cruelty, but in the desperate self-preservation of the poor, the kind who could not afford to share walls with sickness. In the room opposite Eleanor's, two children pressed their faces to the pane, their breath fogging the glass. Their mother, noticing them, snapped the curtains closed with such haste that their shadows blurred like birds startled from a wire. Eleanor felt each gesture like a small stone placed upon her chest. She reached the stairwell, its wooden planks groaning underfoot, and began to climb. But before she reached the landing, a soft voice called from the dimness behind her. "Miss Price?" She turned to find Mr. Callum, a tailor who lived at the end of the corridor. He was a gentleman, slight in build, with spectacles perpetually sliding down the bridge of his nose. Tonight, however, there was a stiffness in his posture that hadn't been there before, a reluctance to step too close. I heard you visited the doctor today," he said, clearing his throat. "Nothing serious, I hope?" His words were polite, but the undertone trembled like fabric pulled too tightly across a frame. Eleanor forced a faint smile. "Just a winter chill," she replied. "Nothing more." Mr. Callum nodded, though the way he stepped subtly backward betrayed him. "Well then, rest well. I expect it will pass soon." He retreated before she could answer, slipping into his room and closing the door with exaggerated quiet. The lock clicked softly afterward, a sound as delicate as a sigh, yet sharp enough to wound. Eleanor continued to her door. She fumbled with her key, her fingers suddenly clumsy, uncooperative. As she pushed the door open, a flash of movement caught her eye. Mrs. Bramley, her immediate neighbour, pulling her curtains shut so quickly the fabric snapped against the rod. For a heartbeat, Eleanor saw nothing but her own reflection in the glass, pale, frightened, distended by the ripple of the pain. She stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. The room, already dim, seemed smaller tonight, as though the walls had leaned inward to listen. The silence was unbearable. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands trembling in her lap. The numbness in her left hand pulsed subtly, not with pain, but with the awareness of its own wrongness. She lifted it, letting lamplight fall over the pale patch that had ruined her peace. In that moment, she understood something with chilling clarity. Illness was not the first punishment. Isolation was. Outside her door, footsteps passed, then stopped. A whisper followed, hushed, urgent. Though she could not make out the words, their shape was unmistakable. Children were shushed. Doors were fastened. A hallway that had once bustled with greeting and commotion now carried only the sound of dread moving from one room to the next. Eleanor leaned her head into her hands and let the dim lamplight flicker across the quiet room. She had not yet been examined by the board. No official had knocked at her door. And already, London was beginning to erase her. Behind curtain lace, she had become a ghost, and the city, sensing fear, was learning to look through her rather than at her. The next morning broke with a colourless dawn, the kind that seeped rather than rose, sliding through London's narrow streets like diluted milk poured over soot. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped outside, hoping the routine of errands might steady her nerves. A simple task, restocking the small remedies she used for washing and cleaning, might anchor her to the familiar, even as her thoughts pulled her toward the unthinkable. The fog lingered low, brushing against her ankles like a cat reluctant to be dismissed. Shop signs creaked overhead, and the faint aroma of baking bread drifted through the cold air, mingling with the acrid tang of chimney smoke. Whitechapel's morning murmured to life with carriage wheels, shouting costermongers, and the occasional laugh from factory boys who had not yet learned how swiftly a city could silence joy. Eleanor crossed the street and approached Bramwell and Sons Apothecary, a narrow brick shop wedged between a fishmonger and a cobbler. The apothecary's windows were always immaculate bottles in shades of amber, emerald, and cobalt arranged like jewels on velvet, each promising a cure for some ailment or another. She had visited countless times over the years, familiar with the gentle chime of its door and the warm medicinal smell that drifted out to greet her. But this morning, as she opened the door and stepped inside, something felt different, as though the air had stiffened. Mr. Bramwell stood behind the counter, polishing a brass scale with deliberate, distracted strokes. He was a stout man, with a neatly trimmed moustache and an air of calm professionalism. Usually, he looked up immediately when the bell chimed. Today, he did not. Instead, he continued polishing, his eyes fixed on a speck of tarnish that did not exist. "Good morning, Mr. Bramwell," Eleanor said softly. The shopkeeper paused, then lifted his gaze. For a moment, his expression softened, habit, perhaps, recognition. But almost as quickly, something shuttered behind his eyes, a tightening, a drawing back. "Miss Price," he said, voice uneven, "what can I do for you this morning?" Eleanor stepped closer to the counter. "Just the usual salve and soap flakes, sir, and perhaps a bit of lavender oil if you have any." Mr. Bramwell hesitated. His fingers drummed lightly against the polished brass. "I see," he murmured, as if considering a matter far larger than the items she had requested. He moved to the shelves, retrieving the soap flakes and the lavender oil with a precision that felt almost rehearsed. But when he reached the section of medicinal balms, the salves Eleanor used so often for chapped winter skin, he slowed. His hand hovered, then curled back to his side. "I'm afraid," he began, turning toward her with a strained politeness, "that we cannot provide the salve today." Eleanor blinked. "Oh, has it sold out?" "No," he said too quickly. "No, not sold out." He swallowed. "It is simply not advisable at present." Not advisable. The words felt colder than the January air outside. She lowered her voice. "Mr. Bramwell, has someone spoken to you?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he set the items he was willing to sell upon the counter carefully, as though they might shatter under too much weight. The lavender oil caught the light, its contents shimmering like captured dusk. At last he said, quietly, "People talk, Miss Price. They talk quickly. They talk cruelly." His eyes flicked toward her hands, though she kept them tightly folded beneath her shawl. "I cannot risk misunderstandings. Not with the customers, not with the inspectors. I have a business to protect." Eleanor felt heat rise in her throat, not anger, but humiliation, sharp and sudden. "I see," she whispered. "I am sorry," he added, though his voice carried the hollow ring of apology without remedy. "Truly." He slid the remaining items toward her. Eleanor reached into her pocket for coins, but her fingers trembled against the cold, the numbness in her left hand sending a shiver of panic through her. Mr. Bramwell noticed and pulled ever so slightly back. "Keep the change," she said quickly, dropping a few coins onto the counter. He nodded, relief softening his stiff posture. "Take care, Miss Price." As she left the shop, the bell chimed once more, a fragile, metallic sound that felt like a farewell. The door clicked behind her, and the fog swallowed the apothecary from view. For a long moment, Eleanor stood motionless on the street, clutching the small paper parcel to her chest. Something inside her shifted the quiet knowledge that she was no longer simply a woman with a numb hand. She was becoming a rumor, a risk, a burden the city did not want to claim. London bustled around her, indifferent and immense, but Eleanor felt the world narrowing, each doorway closing a little faster, each face turning away a little sooner. The apothecary's refusal was not the end. It was the beginning of her disappearance. That evening, the tenement seemed quieter than usual, quiet in a way that felt constructed, rehearsed, as though every resident had silently agreed to remove themselves from the hallway at the precise moment Eleanor returned. The building, usually alive with the rattle of pots, the squeal of children, and the heavy tread of exhausted labourers, held its breath. Eleanor climbed the stairs slowly, listening for the familiar murmur of voices leaking beneath doors, the clatter of dishes being stacked after supper, the coughs that travelled through thin plaster like unwelcome guests. But the only sound was the groan of each step beneath her weight, echoing up and down the stairwell like a reminder of how alone she had become. On the second landing, the lamp had been turned down so low that the flame trembled on the brink of extinguishing. The shadows it cast stretched long and strange, bending around door frames as though peering outward, listening. Eleanor paused, her breath forming a faint mist in the dimness. The air smelled different tonight, less of boiled cabbage and damp wool, more of something brittle and metallic, like fear left out overnight. She reached her door and inserted the key, the click of the lock sounding absurdly loud. From behind Mrs. Bramley's door came a rustle, quick, nervous, unmistakable. The whisper that followed was muffled, but Eleanor didn't need to understand the words. Whispering had a tone all its own, a tone that grew sharper when a person felt the subject of it standing nearby. She pushed open her door and stepped inside, closing the world out with a soft thud. The room greeted her with familiar shadows. The single chair, the basin, the small stove in the corner that never quite warmed the space. Yet even her own belongings seemed distant, as though they had collectively recoiled from her touch. She lit a small candle. Its flame sputtered at first, then steadied, throwing amber glimmers onto the ceiling. In that fragile light, Eleanor sank to the edge of her bed. Her hands rested on her lap, one alive with pins of cold, the other chillingly indifferent to the world. Outside her door, the silence deepened. No footsteps. No late-night quarrels. Not even the drunken stumbling of the man 2 rooms down, whose arrival she could usually predict like clockwork. The tenement was full, but it felt abandoned. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "So this is how it begins," she whispered to the empty room. Not sickness, she had felt no pain. Not yet. But the city's response had already taken root. Creeping through the hallways with a stealth her own affliction seemed intent on mimicking. She rose and moved toward the window. The fog outside clung to the alley like damp linen, turning the gas lamps into blurred yellow orbs. Beneath one of them stood a figure, Mr. Callum, the tailor, smoking with agitated motions. He looked up toward the building more than once, his posture stiff, his breath forming uneven clouds. When Eleanor adjusted her curtain, he startled, crushed the cigarette underfoot, and vanished into the fog as if fleeing a spectre. She pulled the curtains closed. For a moment she pressed her forehead against the cool glass, letting the weight of the night settle over her shoulders. The numbness in her hand had expanded, spreading into her wrist like a cold tide, inching higher with each hour. A distant door creaked open somewhere downstairs, followed by a hushed admonition. "Not now. Wait until morning." She's still awake. Then silence. Perfect silence. Eleanor returned to her bed and wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The candle flickered violently, as if protesting the oppressive stillness, before settling into a nervous, twitching flame. She understood the message the building conveyed without words. She was no longer part of its rhythm. Her footsteps no longer belonged to its nightly chorus. Her presence had become a thing to avoid, a shadow cast too long, a room the others circled as though it were the epicenter of a quiet quake. When she finally lay down, the boards in the ceiling creaked, but not with footsteps. The movements were too careful, too deliberate, as though someone were shifting their weight in an attempt not to be heard. And so Eleanor drifted into a restless half-sleep, listening to the sound of a tenement that had chosen silence over sympathy. A tenement where a woman could still hear the living, but only if she strained, listened hard, and remembered what community had sounded like before fear hollowed it out. Tonight, there were no footsteps, only the soft, steady erosion of everything familiar. Morning crept reluctantly into Whitechapel, its dim grey light filtering through the grime that clung to every window pane. Eleanor awoke to the hollow stillness that had settled over the tenement like dust. The quiet had shape, now a presence, a weight as though the building itself waited for something inevitable to unfold. She dressed slowly, her movements careful, not from pain but from an unspoken fear that sudden gestures might draw attention. The numbness in her hand had not lessened. If anything, it had grown bolder, reaching across her knuckles like an invading frost. She avoided looking at it too long. A soft thud at her door startled her. It was not a knock no human knuckle struck the wood. It was something placed, something delivered without contact. She hesitated, every breath thick in her throat. Then, with trembling fingers, she opened the door. On the floor lay a single envelope, plain, cream-colored, unmarked by name. But the seal pressed in thick red wax bore the unmistakable crest of the London Public Health Office. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The letter no one wanted to receive. The letter no one dared deliver by hand. She snatched it from the floor and closed the door swiftly behind her, as though the hallway itself might accuse her. For a long moment she simply stared at it, listening to the faint groaning of the building as neighbors stirred behind their doors. She imagined their ears pricking, their bodies stilling, each one silently wondering whether the letter had found its mark. At last, Eleanor broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet, the handwriting rigid and official. Miss Eleanor Price, you are hereby required to present yourself for medical evaluation at the East London Contagion Board office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Failure to comply may result in compulsory escort by the Public Health Inspectorate. Her knees weakened. She sank into the chair beside her small table. There it was, the summons. No accusation yet, but the shape of one crouched behind every word. Eleanor traced the ink with trembling fingertips, the numbness in her left hand giving the illusion of touching paper through a glove. A knock real. This time jolted her from her thoughts. "Miss Price?" a voice whispered through the door. It was Mrs. Bramley. Eleanor approached cautiously and opened the door only a few inches. The older woman stood stiffly, holding her shawl tight around her, as though the air near Eleanor crackled with unseen danger. Her gaze darted to the envelope on the table. "You received it then," she murmured. Eleanor swallowed. "How did you?" "They've been watching the street," Mrs. Bramley interrupted. "Inspectors came at dawn. Said nothing, but they don't come unless a report's been filed." Her eyes flicked again to Eleanor's hand before she caught herself. She looked ashamed, but only for a moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Truly. But the building can't afford attention. Not with the children here. Not with my husband ill already." The apology dissolved into the hallway's stale air. Before Eleanor could reply, Mrs. Bramley stepped back, pulling her shawl tighter. "You should go," she said. "Best to get it over with." Her voice softened to a fragile tremor. "And Eleanor, don't walk alone if you can help it." The door closed, gently but firmly. Eleanor stared at the space where Mrs. Bramley had stood. The faint scent of lavender and starch lingered only a moment before fading entirely. She returned to her chair, the the letter trembling in her grasp. The building around her buzzed faintly with life now, footsteps, hushed conversations, doors opening just enough to glimpse the corridor. She realized with a sting that they were waiting to learn whether she would be removed, waiting to learn whether fear must widen its circle. She folded the letter carefully, though the edges shook in her hands. She placed it beside the candle on her table. Its presence filled the room more heavily than any piece of paper should. As the hours passed, Eleanor remained seated, listening to the subtle shifts and murmurs behind the plaster walls. The city beyond her window pulsed with indifferent life, but within this narrow room, the future tightened its grip around her. The letter felt like a verdict, and yet the trial had not even begun. The morning of the vanishing began like any other in Whitechapel, with the sound of coal carts scraping over frost-hardened ruts and the low moan of factory whistles stirring the neighborhood awake. But beneath these familiar sounds ran something quieter, more chilling, an expectant hush, like the moment before a match is struck in a darkened room. Rumor always traveled quickly in the tenements, but on this particular morning it moved with uncanny precision, slipping under doors and curling through stairwells like the fog that haunted London's winters. Before the sun had lifted itself fully over the chimneys, neighbours already whispered of Margaret Hale, the seamstress from the top floor who had not been seen since the break of dawn. Eleanor first noticed the absence while peering out her window, watching the street below with the restless vigilance that now marked her days. Margaret's window, usually cracked open to release the heat of her sewing lamp, remained shut. No bobbins rolled across her sill, no thread drifted out like pale spider silk. It was as if she had never lived there at all. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold passed through Eleanor. Disappearances were not new to Whitechapel, but they were rarely discussed openly. People left when debts rose or tempers snapped or opportunities called, or so the stories went. But the truth had sharper teeth. Sometimes people vanished with only a slip of paper left in their place. Sometimes they were taken. A sudden knock downstairs echoed up through the building. Firm, practiced, unmistakably official. Eleanor froze, her hand grasping the window frame so tightly that the wood creaked. She heard doors crack open along the hallway, saw shadows shift under the seams of floorboards, felt the tenement collecting its breath. The knock came again, then a voice. "This is the East London Public Health Office. Open the door." The building seemed to curl inward on itself. Footsteps whispered, not one pair but several. Heavy boots. The scrape of something metallic, a latch, perhaps, or the hinge of a carrying case. Eleanor stepped back from the window, pressing herself into the shadowed corner of her small room. From below came the muffled exchange, a door reluctantly opening, a startled gasp, hurried conversation, then the soft, shamed sound of someone crying behind their hands. A woman's voice, Margaret's. Eleanor's stomach twisted. The inspectors spoke in low tones, the sort of bureaucratic calm that stripped events of emotion. Eleanor could not hear every word, but she caught fragments. Mandatory evaluation for her safety and others. Transport will be provided. Transport. The word thudded through her like a blow. The tenement staircase groaned beneath the weight of their ascent. Eleanor found herself holding her breath, as though even air might betray her. Though she was not the one they had come for today, she felt the invisible thread connecting them, two women entangled in a fear older than the city itself. The inspectors emerged onto the landing below, guiding Margaret between them. She did not resist. Her shawl was clutched so tightly around her hands that the fabric trembled. Her face glistened with tears she tried to hide by bowing her head. No one spoke to her. No neighbor stepped forward. No farewell softened her departure. Doors remained shut, curtains frozen in place. Only the creaking boards testified that she had been led away, that she had existed at all. As they passed beneath Eleanor's door, Margaret lifted her gaze for the briefest of moments. Their eyes met two women suspended on the same precipice, one falling, the other waiting for the ground to vanish beneath her. Then Margaret's expression broke, and she lowered her head again. The inspectors escorted her down the stairs, their boots thundering dully through the hollow spaces of the building. The front door opened. A gust of cold air swept into the tenement like a gasp of dread. Then it shut, leaving an uncanny quiet in its wake. Whitechapel Row exhaled. Doors unlocked, curtains fluttered. Voices rose in cautious murmur. She was pale for weeks. I heard she couldn't feel her fingertips. God help the rest of us if it's what they think. Eleanor backed away from the door until her knees struck the bed. She sat heavily, her breath quivering. Margaret's empty window across the street seemed to stare back at her, a hollow eye in the face of a neighborhood that devoured its sick in silence. She looked down at her own hand, that traitorous patch of numb, pale skin, and curled her fingers into a trembling fist. Margaret's removal was not a warning. It was a prophecy, and Eleanor knew the next knock might not stop at someone else's door. London did not panic all at once. Panic in this city rarely arrived. With a scream it arrived with silence, a tightening of space, a pulling back of breath, an unease that travelled more swiftly than any carriage or telegram. And in the days following Margaret Hale's quiet removal, that unease spread through Whitechapel with the chill of a winter draught slipping beneath every door. Eleanor felt it everywhere. In the way conversations hushed as she approached, in the way footsteps paused on stairwells, not to greet her but to avoid her, in the way children were ushered inside with abrupt, nervous gestures, as though evening had come early. The city was changing its posture, bracing itself, perhaps, or recoiling. Outside, London's fog thickened until it resembled a suspended breath, stretching from street to spire. Carriages moved cautiously through it, their wheels carving narrow paths in the slush. Newspaper boys shouted headlines into the mist, but their voices wavered, shapeless, swallowed by the air. Eleanor crossed Whitechapel Road with her shawl tight around her shoulders, conscious of the distance others maintained. Even those who had once nodded in passing now glanced away, as if acknowledging her might summon some curse. A woman at a fruit stall stepped back sharply when Eleanor reached for an apple, her hand recoiling mid-air. "Best not, miss," the vendor murmured, eyes darting to Eleanor's wrapped hand. "Not today. Not ever," she meant. Eleanor withdrew her hand, heat flushing her cheeks despite the cold. She walked on, past the butcher's window where a cleaver hung still as a pendulum, past the lamplighter, who paused mid-task to watch her journey with narrowed concern, past the tram line where a conductor stood with arms crossed, whispering something to the passengers who stared with too much interest. The whole district seemed to lean subtly away from her. She realized, with an ache that hollowed her chest, that fear had a sound, not a scream, not a sob, but the absence of both. Fear sounded like doors closing softly. Fear sounded like street corners where no one lingered. Fear sounded like London breathing shallow, careful breaths. That afternoon, the sky darkened prematurely, heavy clouds pressing low over the chimneys. Eleanor hurried home, her steps quicker than usual, her fingers numb inside her gloves, not from winter, but from dread. She could not shake the image of Margaret's pale face as she had been led away. She imagined the inspectors whispering to each other, their boots slick with melted frost, their notebooks filled with names. Her name among them. When she reached her building, she found Mr. Callum standing outside, his collar turned up against the cold. He seemed torn between approaching her and retreating into the doorway. Eventually he settled for neither, speaking from a distance that felt half a room too wide. "Miss Price," he began, voice trembling with uncomfortable sympathy. "Everyone is unsettled. They fear another visit." Eleanor swallowed. "I understand. It's not just the tenants," he said, glancing toward the street. "The inspectors were seen again this morning, asking questions." Questions. A colder word than judgment. Judgment fell swiftly, decisively. Questions meant they had not yet finished looking. He paused, lowering his voice even further. If there is anything you need, I fear I cannot help. But I wanted to say I'm sorry for the way people have acted. Eleanor managed a faint nod. She did not blame him for stepping backward when she approached. She would have stepped backward, too, were she in his place. When she climbed the stairs, she noticed the hallway had changed. Someone had placed a bowl of carbolic-soaked rags outside a door, a crude, misguided barrier. Another resident had hung a sprig of rosemary, as though scent alone could ward off contagion. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and every creak felt like an accusation. Inside her room, the shadows had grown longer. Eleanor sat by the window and watched as evening swallowed the last traces of daylight. The fog outside thickened until the street below became only a suggestion, shapes in motion, muffled voices, the glow of lamps reduced to dim halos. London was holding its breath, and breath, once held too long, had only two eventual outcomes: release or collapse. Eleanor's eyes drifted toward the folded letter on her table, the summons for her evaluation. Tomorrow, it would be her turn. Her chest tightened. The city, the neighbors, the fog, the silence, they all seemed to lean in, waiting to learn whether they should fear her or forget her. For now, London held its breath. Tomorrow, it might exhale, and she did not know whether that exhale would cleanse her name or erase it. The morning of Eleanor's summons dawned with a thin, metallic light, the kind that made London appear carved from pewter. The fog hung low and heavy, pressing itself against windows as though trying to peer into every private room. Eleanor dressed in silence, aware that each motion, the tug of a sleeve, the tying of a shawl, carried the weight of finality. Her hand, numb and pale beneath the fabric, felt strangely distant, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. At precisely 8 o'clock, a sharp rap sounded at her door, not frantic, but deliberate, official. Eleanor's breath stalled. For a heartbeat, she considered pretending not to hear it, hiding in the stillness she had grown accustomed to. But denial was a luxury her neighborhood no longer permitted. The inspector would knock only once more before entering without invitation. She opened the door. Inspector Charles Lemming stood on the landing, his posture rigid, his expression carved in stone. He wore a long black coat buttoned to the throat and carried an iron clipboard tucked beneath one arm. Its edges were reinforced with metal bands, as though the papers it held were too dangerous to trust to mere wood or leather. A small brass crest shimmered at the top. London Public Health Office. His eyes swept over Eleanor with the cold appraisal of a man accustomed to observing fear and unmoved by it. "Miss Eleanor Price?" His voice was crisp, clipped, entirely devoid of softness. "Yes," she murmured. "You are expected for evaluation. I will accompany you." It was not a request. Eleanor gathered her shawl tighter around her shoulders and nodded. The inspector stepped aside to allow her into the corridor, but even his courtesy felt procedural, not human. As they descended the stairs, doors along the hallway quieted, shutters stilled, and whispers dissolved like smoke. The tenement watched without watching its people, hiding behind the thin veneer of wood and plaster. At the building's entrance, the inspector paused long enough to jot something on his clipboard. Each scratch of his pen sounded like a nail driven into a coffin. "Standard documentation," he said without looking up. Outside, the street greeted them with the muted roar of morning. Vendors shouted half-heartedly from behind their carts, their voices frayed with anxiety. Fog thickened around the pair as they walked, curling around Inspector Lemming's boots like tendrils of unwelcome familiarity. Eleanor kept her gaze low, watching the edge of her shoes disappear and reappear beneath the mist. After several moments, the inspector spoke again. "You were seen visiting Dr. Nathaniel Harrow earlier this week." Eleanor's heart fluttered, Yes. He filed a preliminary concern regarding sensory loss. His tone did not waver. Loss of sensation is among the early indicators. Does the numbness persist? Her voice was barely audible. It does. He made another notation. They walked past Bramwell and Sons Apothecary. The shop's owner stood at the doorway but turned aside sharply when he recognized Eleanor. Inspector Lemming noticed. "People in your neighborhood appear uneasy," he observed. "They fear contagion," she replied softly. "They fear consequence," he corrected. "Fear of disease is as old as London. Fear of blame is newer and far more potent." They crossed into a quieter street. The houses here were broader, sturdier, their windows unbroken, their chimneys smoking steadily. Eleanor felt suddenly misplaced, like a blot of soot drifting into a polished parlor. As they approached the Contagion Board office, a grey brick building with barred windows and a courtyard devoid of life, the knot in her stomach tightened. A wrought-iron sign swung overhead, groaning softly in the wind. Eleanor's steps faltered. Inspector Lemming halted and turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Price," he said, "this evaluation is a precaution, not a sentence. Do not assume your future before it is written." His words were firm, almost stern, but not unkind. And perhaps that was what frightened her most. Kindness from a man whose duty was to escort the afflicted to their fate. They crossed the threshold into the building. The door closed behind them with a soft, final click. Inside, the air smelled of ink, disinfectant, and something colder still, the scent of decisions waiting to be made. Inspector Lemming lifted his clipboard once more. "Your examination will begin shortly," he said. But Eleanor already felt examined. Not by the doctor who would soon test her, not by the inspector who guided her, but by the entire city, a city holding its breath while deciding whether she belonged to it or beyond it. The Contagion Board office was not meant to feel welcoming. Its corridors were narrow, its walls stripped of anything decorative, its benches hard enough to keep spines straight and spirits unsettled. Yet it was not within this building that Eleanor's true dread took root, but in the place Inspector Lemming led her next. After her initial questioning, she was instructed to wait in a small vestibule where the air tasted faintly of damp paper and disinfectant. The inspector disappeared behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" and emerged moments later with a directive. "Miss Price," he said, voice clipped as ever, "you are to be escorted to the East London Auxiliary Workhouse for examination. Their facilities are better suited to cases such as yours." Cases such as yours. The words rang with an implication Eleanor dared not name. A carriage waited outside, not one of elegance, but a closed, utilitarian vehicle painted in drab municipal grey. Its windows were narrow slits, its wheels creaking with the wear of too many grim errands. Eleanor stepped inside, guided by the inspector's steady hand, and the carriage lurched forward into the fog-bound streets. The city passed slowly. Rows of brick houses, factories belching smoke into the sky, children running in tattered coats, oblivious to the silent machinery of fear that governed the adult's world. As the carriage turned away from the busier lanes, the buildings thinned, replaced by wide, desolate lots and looming structures whose chimneys rose like blackened fingers. One such structure appeared ahead, tall, severe, unmistakably forbidding: the East London Auxiliary Workhouse. A place built not for rehabilitation but for containment. The carriage halted before a wrought-iron gate. An attendant unlatched it with a long, unpleasant scrape, and Eleanor stepped down onto cobblestones slick with last night's rain. The air here differed sharply from that of Whitechapel, harsher, colder, saturated with the sharp sting of carbolic acid. It burned the nose, it clung to the tongue, it seeped into the fabric of her shawl. A matron approached, tall, angular, her keys jangling like distant church bells. "Name," she demanded. "Eleanor Price." The matron's eyes skimmed over her as one inspects a parcel with a damaged corner. "You will follow me." Inside, the workhouse revealed its nature in pieces. A hallway lined with locked doors, a row of beds separated by thin curtains, each made with military precision. A long table where instruments sat arranged like an array of cold, gleaming judgments. No laughter, no conversation, only the faint dripping of water from a cracked pipe and the echo of distant footsteps. "How long must I stay?" Eleanor asked. The matron paused. For a moment, Eleanor thought she might answer with compassion. "As long as required," she replied instead, moving on. A physician emerged from behind a curtain, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. His gloves were spotless, too spotless. "Miss Price," he greeted without smiling, "we have been informed of your symptoms. You will undergo sensory mapping, dermatological inspection, and bacteriological sampling." Eleanor swallowed. "Will it hurt?" "The procedures?" "No." He hesitated a breath, a crack in his professional shell. "The waiting may." He led her to a chair beside a metal tray of instruments. A lamp buzzed overhead, casting pale light across Eleanor's exposed hand. The doctor approached with a cotton swab soaked in carbolic, its sharp scent cutting through the stale air. As he applied it to her skin, Eleanor braced, expecting the bite of chemical burn. Nothing. No heat, no sting, no sensation at all. The doctor watched her face closely, too closely. "You do not feel that, Miss Price?" "No," she whispered. He nodded slowly, his expression inscrutable. "I must ask you to remain calm during these procedures. Panic will not change the results." Eleanor inhaled shakily. Panic, she realized, was not the enemy, it was the inevitability. The doctor pressed on, pricking, brushing, and marking areas of sensation and absence. Each time she failed to react, his pencil moved more quickly across his chart. Scribbles, underlines. A question mark struck through. Behind him, the matron observed with folded arms, her gaze impenetrable. The room grew colder. Finally, the physician stepped back. "You will await further instruction," he said, already turning away to wash his hands with unnecessary vigor. "Do not leave the premises." Eleanor stood, weak-legged, staring at the basin where carbolic fumes rose like ghostly vapors. The workhouse hummed faintly around her, distant murmurs, clattering keys, the hollow resonance of a building that had seen far too many lives suspended between fear and fate. She realized then that this place was not merely an institution, it was a threshold, a place where the city determined who remained part of London and who was quietly removed from it. As the matron escorted her to a waiting bench, Eleanor felt the walls closing in not cruelly, but indifferently, like a machine performing its duty. The carbolic stung her throat. Her heart pounded. Her hand lay cold and senseless in her lap. In the East London workhouse, it was not the illness that terrified her most. It was the certainty that the city already believed she carried it. The bells of St. Bartholomew's never rang loudly, their tone was too thin, too weary, worn down by decades of soot and sorrow. Yet on the afternoon, Eleanor was escorted from the workhouse waiting bench to the adjoining chapel for pastoral counsel. The bells seemed to tremble rather than toll, as though even their metal hearts were uneasy. The chapel stood at the far end of the auxiliary grounds, a modest structure of weathered stone and stained glass windows, dulled by London's perpetual grime. Inside, the air was warmer than the corridors, though no less oppressive. Beeswax candles flickered in brass holders, casting amber pools of trembling light across the pews. The smell of old wood and lingering incense hovered beneath an undercurrent of carbolic that clung to Eleanor like an unwelcome perfume. She was ushered inside by the matron and told to wait at the front, near the pulpit. For a moment, Eleanor allowed herself to breathe more freely. The chapel, though austere, felt quieter, less clinical, less suffocating than the workhouse halls. She traced her fingers over the worn velvet of a nearby kneeler, grateful for a sensation she could still feel, the faint tickle of frayed fabric against her untainted right hand. The door at the back of the chapel opened with a hushed creak. Reverend Aldous Finch entered. He was a slight man, mid-aged, with soft features that might once have made him appear youthful, had not the burdens of his ministry hollowed them into premature weariness. His clerical collar was neatly pressed, but his eyes, a pale, uncertain grey, betrayed nerves he attempted to hide. "Miss Price," he greeted her, offering a small bow of his head. "Thank you for waiting." His voice carried a warmth that seemed genuine, yet strained, as though he were reaching for a tone he once possessed effortlessly but now found elusive. "Reverend," Eleanor murmured. He gestured for her to sit in the front pew. She obeyed, settling into the wooden seat as the Reverend sat beside her, leaving a careful distance between their shoulders. Too careful. He folded his hands, exhaled, and began. "I understand you are here for evaluation." The word clung awkwardly to his tongue, like a bead of soot that refused to dissolve. "I have been asked to speak with you, to offer reassurance, comfort, or simply an ear, whatever you may wish." Eleanor nodded, though her throat tightened painfully. "I'm not certain what I wish, Reverend." He looked at her gently. "Few in your position are." He opened a small prayer book, its spine cracked, its pages feathered with use. Yet before he could read from it, his hands hesitated. His fingers hovered above the page. His lips parted, then closed again. Eleanor watched him with growing unease. "Reverend Finch?" she prompted. "Is something wrong?" He swallowed. The soft creak of the pew beneath him revealed a tremor in his posture. "I must confess, Miss Price." He paused, searching her face as though asking permission for his own inadequacy. "I have counseled many during illness, during typhus outbreaks, during winters when consumption claimed half a street. My words have always come, even if imperfect." His fingers tightened around the prayer book. "But this," his voice faltered, "this affliction carries a weight unlike others, not for its danger, but for its exile." Eleanor lowered her gaze. "People do not fear sickness alone," he continued, forcing steadiness into his tone. "They fear what it demands: separation, silence, removal. They fear the soul's isolation more than the body's." He turned a page in his book but did not read from it. Instead, he whispered, "When the inspectors bring someone here, the congregation avoids this chapel for days. They speak of contagion, yes, but also of judgment, as if the afflicted have been marked not only by illness, but by fate." His voice broke faintly on the last word. Eleanor stared at the candle-lit altar, its flicker softened by a film of dust on the brass. "Reverend," she said quietly, "are you saying you believe me cursed?" "No," he replied, swiftly, too swiftly. "No, but I fear others do, and I fear the power such belief holds." Silence poured into the chapel's vaulted ceiling. Somewhere outside, a gull cried, thin, ragged, lost in the fog. The Reverend closed the prayer book. "I wanted to pray with you," he admitted, "but the words escape me. I do not know if they would bring comfort or deepen your dread." Eleanor breathed in the scent of extinguished candles and cold stone. "I don't need words," she said softly, "just truth." He looked at her with sorrow that seemed to seep from the marrow of his bones. "Then the truth is this, Miss Price. Whatever the board concludes, your suffering has already begun. Not here," he gestured toward her still, pale hand, "but out there." She nodded, tears pricking her eyes. Reverend Finch rose slowly, placing a hesitant hand over his heart instead of offering it to her. "May courage carry you," he whispered, "for I fear faith alone cannot." When he turned to leave, the chapel dimmed, as though the candles themselves bowed in sympathy. Eleanor remained seated long after he had gone, her breath fogging the cold air, for she now understood what the clergyman, in all his gentleness, could not bring himself to say aloud. Even hope was beginning to distance itself from her, and London, with all its prayers and penitence, had already begun to step back. The examination chamber lay deeper within the workhouse, past corridors that narrowed into long, breathless passages, where light dwindled and sound seemed to vanish into the stone. Eleanor followed the matron's sharp footsteps, each echo mingling with the faint, rhythmic drip of condensation falling from fractured pipes overhead. The air grew colder, denser, until the scent of carbolic thinned into something more clinical, the odor of metal, cloth, and resignation. At last, they reached a door marked Sensory Evaluation Room. A thin strip of yellowed glass above the frame glowed weakly, the lamp behind it burning with a stubborn, flickering pulse. The matron pushed the door open and gestured for Eleanor to enter. Her expression did not soften. Inside, the room was austere. A single chair stood in the center beneath a downward-facing lamp, its light too bright, its glare exposing every contour of the person beneath it. A tray of instruments rested nearby, thin needles arranged in a row, each gleaming with antiseptic sheen, cotton swabs, charcoal pencils, a notebook thick with pages that had been filled long before Eleanor's arrival. Dr. Alistair Goring, a younger physician with hollow cheeks and eyes that carried both exhaustion and caution, stepped forward. "Miss Price," he said quietly, "I will begin now. You may sit." Eleanor lowered herself onto the chair. The light washed over her like cold milk. She clasped her hands together, trying not to show the tremor that had begun to seep into her breath. Dr. Goring rolled a small metal stool toward her and sat. He opened the notebook, dipping his pen into an inkwell, as though preparing to record not simply her condition but her fate. "Extend your left hand, please." Eleanor obeyed. The pale patch on her knuckles, so small and unassuming at first, seemed monstrous beneath the lamp. The doctor examined it without comment, but the tension in his jaw suggested he had seen its like before, and rarely with hopeful outcomes. "We will test for reflex and sensation," he said. "Tell me when you feel anything." He lifted the first needle. It was thin as a hair, wickedly precise, meant not to harm but to reveal. He pressed it gently into the skin near the edge of the patch. Eleanor waited for the faint sting. Nothing. Another prick deeper, this time landed farther inward. Still nothing. Her heart sank. The doctor's pencil scratched across the page. He moved methodically, tracing the boundaries of her numbness with a series of pricks, taps, and cold touches from a metal rod that should have sent shivers down her arm. But Eleanor felt only the pressure where her nerves still lived, and beyond that, a soft, terrible void, a silence beneath the skin. "It remains insensate," Dr. Goring murmured, more to his notes than to her. He switched instruments. A small brush made of fine horsehair glided across the top of her hand. Eleanor's breath steadied, praying she might feel its whisper-light caress. She felt nothing. The doctor paused at that, sighing through his nose as though marking the end of a possibility. "We will continue," he said gently. He pressed a cube of ice wrapped in muslin against different parts of her hand. The cold stabbed like needles in her forearm, but the marked patch lay dormant, indifferent, as though carved from marble. "How long have you experienced this lack of sensation?" he asked without looking up. 2 days, she whispered. "And has it spread?" Eleanor hesitated. I cannot be certain. Sometimes it feels further, but I do not trust my own fear." Fear, in truth, was the only sensation left unwavering. Dr. Goring made another long notation, then placed his instruments aside. "Miss Price," he said softly, folding his hands, "you have been very brave. Many tremble so violently during these tests that I cannot complete them." Eleanor swallowed. What do the results mean?" His silence stretched like a shadow across the floor. "They mean further evaluation is necessary." he replied, though the cadence of his voice betrayed what he withheld. The board must review these findings. Until they reach a conclusion, you must remain under observation. Observation. Containment, cloaked in polite phrasing. The matron stepped forward, her keys jingling at her side like a reminder that freedom was no longer Eleanor's to claim. "You will be assigned a temporary room," she said. "Meals are provided. Do not leave this wing without escort." Eleanor rose on unsteady legs, her numb hand limp at her side. Dr. Goring closed the notebook, securing it with a metal clasp that clicked shut like a verdict. She stepped toward the door, but before she crossed the threshold, she heard him murmur so softly she was unsure whether it was meant for her. "I pray the board sees mercy in what they read." Mercy. Eleanor paused, her breath trembling. Mercy was the one sensation the needles could not test, and the one she feared London was least able to feel. As she walked down the dim corridor, escorted by the matron's cold shadow, Eleanor knew this much. The pricks that drew no pain had drawn something far worse, the attention of a city that believed numbness was not merely a symptom, but a sentence. Back in Whitechapel, the Price household had never been a place of comfort, but it had been a place of familiarity, a narrow room shared with her younger sister, a mantel crowded with mismatched trinkets, and above it, the single-family portrait taken in a cramped photography shop off Bishopsgate. Eleanor had stood at the center of that portrait, hands clasped, chin lifted ever so slightly, attempting to appear hopeful for the camera's long exposure. It was the only image they owned that proved they had once been whole. Now, that portrait was gone. It happened quietly, without ceremony. On the very evening, Eleanor was taken to the workhouse for further evaluation. Her sister, Mara, returned home from the mending shop, cheeks red from cold and worry, only to pause in the doorway and feel an absence she sensed before she saw it. The mantel looked oddly bare. Dust clung to the thin line where the frame had rested for years. The small, indented space, lighter than the surrounding soot-stained wood, revealed precisely what had been removed. The portrait. Mara set down her bundle, the fabric spilling across the table in muted colors. She scanned the room with rising panic. Then she stepped into the narrow corridor outside their door. "Mrs. Bramley," she called, voice trembling. "Did you move our picture? Has someone—" But the hallway answered with the hush of closed doors and turned backs. A few whispers carried down from the stairwell, quick, deliberate, unfinished phrases swallowed before they became whole. "Shouldn't keep such things. Best for everyone. Bad luck to leave it out." Mara's breath caught. She pressed a hand to her chest, the realization settling over her like ash. Someone had taken the portrait not out of theft, but out of superstition. Eleanor's likeness, her face, her memory, had become an object of fear. To keep her image on display was, in the eyes of frightened neighbors, to invite contagion through the very air that brushed against the frame, as though illness could cling to the outline of a smile, as though danger could seep through sepia ink. Mara pushed into their room again, closing the door with a trembling hand. The absence on the mantel seemed to pulse like an open wound. She approached it slowly, touching the wood where Eleanor's face had once rested in paper form. It felt colder than the rest of the room. "Why would they do this?" she whispered, though she knew the answer. Fear had a way of rearranging the world, of shifting objects, rewriting rules, and erasing people long before any official decree. In this tenement, where walls were too thin to contain sickness or secrets, survival often meant severing ties before they had the chance to become liabilities. Still, knowing this did little to soften the ache that spread through Mara's chest. She knelt beside the bed and searched beneath it, hoping desperately that the portrait had simply fallen. Dust coated her fingers. A lone button rolled out from the shadows. No frame. A knock sounded. Not at their door. At the door across the hall. Mara froze. ears straining. "It must be removed," a man's voice murmured. "We can't have reminders, not when the inspectors are watching the building." "Her sister is still here," a woman whispered urgently. "If she sees—" I took it quietly. "She won't know who." Footsteps retreated. A door closed. Mara stood slowly, her breath shaking, her fists clenched. Eleanor, she thought, would not have blamed them. She would have understood the cowardice that sprouted where compassion once lived. But Mara was not Eleanor. She felt anger gather like storm clouds behind her ribs. She walked to the window. Outside, Whitechapel's fog drifted past like slow-moving ghosts, its pale tendrils winding through alleys and lampposts, carrying whispers of the sick and the soon forgotten. Somewhere within that muffled world, Eleanor was waiting alone, frightened, and now erased from the room she once called home. Mara pressed her forehead to the cold glass. "I will not let them forget you," she whispered. But even as she said the words, she sensed the truth. The city had begun the process of forgetting already. It started with a portrait removed from a mantel. Next, it would move on to the woman herself. The Price household, once marked by the rhythm of ordinary life, had begun to unravel with a quiet deliberation that Eleanor could neither hear nor resist. The silence that crept along the corridors, once merely a backdrop to footsteps and whispered gossip, had taken shape as a force capable of unmaking bonds that had seemed permanent. It was in this silence, heavy and pervasive, that Eleanor's closest tether to normalcy, her engagement to Thomas Harding, a clerk in the city's shipping office, began to fray. Thomas had been the kind of man who carried the air of gentleness carefully wrapped around him, like a fine scarf shielding a fragile throat from the wind. Their courtship had been quiet, almost unnoticed by the bustle of Whitechapel Row, a thread of hope stitched into the grey fabric of their lives. Yet as rumours of Eleanor's condition spread, that thread began to unravel, leaving the familiar warmth of their relationship raw and exposed. The evening Thomas came to the tenement, Eleanor had barely touched the door before she sensed the weight of judgment pressing down. He stood there, coat buttoned too tightly against the chill, eyes flicking toward her hand, then away again, as if trying to convince himself she was unchanged, though he could not quite succeed. "Eleanor," he began, voice low, uncertain, as though every word might shatter the fragile barrier between them. I heard—" "Yes," she whispered. The single word carried the heaviness of days spent imagining the inevitable. The letter, the board, the inspection. Thomas exhaled sharply, a sound more desperate than angry. "I don't know what to say. I cannot—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair. His eyes darted to the floor, then back to her pale, numb hand, as if seeking reassurance from a phantom. "I cannot bear the thought of what they say about you, about this." Eleanor's heart twisted. She had expected fear. She had expected avoidance, but not this quiet retreat, this subtle erosion of intimacy that spoke louder than any shout. "I am still me," she said softly, voice trembling. "I have not changed." "You have," Thomas whispered, though his lips barely moved. "I do not doubt your character, Eleanor, but I fear for what the world believes, for the whispers, for the looks. I cannot stand to be seen with you like this. Not here. Not now." The words fell between them, sharp and precise. Eleanor felt the warmth drain from her chest, as if a lamp had been extinguished. Silence grew heavy around them, pressing into the corners of the room, curling around the furniture, bending the light from the single candle. She wanted to cry out, to grab him, to tell him that the world could not dictate her worth. But she remained still, the numbness of her hand a cruel echo of the numbness settling over her heart. Thomas's hand trembled as he removed the small clasped box from his coat pocket, the token of their engagement. A promise made in safer times. He set it gently on the table between them, as if distance could protect them both. "Perhaps," he said, voice barely audible, "we should wait. Perhaps we should reconsider." Eleanor watched as he stepped back, then turned toward the door. The soft thud of his boots on the stair echoed through the apartment, each beat a punctuation of separation. When the door closed, the silence that remained was suffocating. No footsteps, no whispers, only the lingering weight of absence. She sank into the chair by the window, staring out at Whitechapel's fog-choked streets. Gas lamps shivered in the haze, illuminating the indifferent city that had begun to unravel her life in ways sickness alone could not. Outside, children laughed and played, unaware of the invisible barriers that fear had constructed. Inside, Eleanor felt the true cruelty of her condition. It did not merely mark her body, it reshaped every connection she had once counted on. A marriage broken not by malice, nor by choice, but by the quiet, creeping power of London's fear. And Eleanor knew, with a cold certainty, that this was only the beginning. The city was learning to speak in silence, and in silence it was already condemning her. The workhouse ward was nothing like Eleanor had imagined, and yet it was precisely as she feared. She was escorted down narrow corridors, past locked doors that hummed faintly with the sound of other lives paused, until she reached a room whose windows were frosted over, not from winter alone, but from the collective breath of those who had lingered too long inside. The frosted glass blurred the world outside into a pale, indistinct smudge, as though the city itself were unwilling to witness what occurred within these walls. Inside, the air was dry and sharp, scented with carbolic and disinfectant. The faint odor of human skin, pale, anxious, and overworked, mingled with it, forming an invisible fog that pressed down on Eleanor's chest. The room was long and narrow, with rows of beds, each separated by thin curtains that shivered even when no one moved. The beds were simple, metal-framed, and impeccably made, yet the neatness did nothing to soften the chill of their sterility. A faint rattle of chains and the occasional scrape of wooden heels against the floor punctuated the oppressive silence. Eleanor was guided to a bed near the middle of the room. She sat heavily, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, the numb patch on her hand hidden beneath its folds. Across the room, other occupants stirred. Some sat upright, staring blankly at the floor. Others lay beneath thin blankets, their breaths shallow and rhythmically uneven. A nurse moved silently between them, attending without word or glance, a shadow in human form, administering care as a matter of duty rather than compassion. The frosted windows seemed to trap the light, turning the room into a muted world of shadows and whispers. Outside, the street may have continued with its chaos, its gas lamps and raucous cries, but within, time had been suspended. Eleanor felt it pressing against her, a slow, inexorable compression, as though the walls themselves sought to remind her of her insignificance. A door creaked softly, and a young physician entered. He carried no malice, yet his eyes were careful, measured, as if each blink might reveal too much knowledge. Dr. Whitmore, Eleanor would later learn his name, approached with gloved hands and a notebook pressed to his chest. "Miss Price," he said, voice low, "we will begin your full examination shortly. Please remain seated." Eleanor nodded, her lips dry. The ward was already full of eyes, not her own, not the physician's, but the collective scrutiny of the patients themselves. They watched with quiet, unnerving attention, their gazes carrying both empathy and fear. It was as though they, too, had been marked by what the city refused to name. Dr. Whitmore knelt before her, lifting her left hand gently. The numb patch, pale against the flickering lamplight, seemed almost luminous. Eleanor's breath caught as the physician's fingers traced it, pressing lightly, then withdrawing. Each contact carried the weight of scrutiny and documentation, a mechanical ritual that reduced her body to lines and charts, to the sum of its failures. "Do you feel this?" he asked. gently pricking near the edge of the patch with a sterilized pin. Eleanor shook her head. Nothing. No sting. No sensation at all. He made a notation in his book, pausing to glance at her expression, then continued brushing, tapping, and marking areas with methodical precision. Each procedure was clinical, devoid of reassurance, and the room itself absorbed her response, amplifying the isolation. The other patients shifted subtly, some recoiling at the sight of her numb hand, others leaning slightly closer, as if drawn by the shared terror. When the examination concluded, Eleanor was left sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the frosted windows, her breath fogging the glass. Outside, the city remained indifferent. Inside, the ward seemed to pulse with the quiet terror of suspended lives. Here, in the frost-shadowed room, Eleanor understood that she was neither ill nor safe. She was an object of observation, a measure of fear, a symbol of what the city could no longer contain. And as she sank beneath her shawl, the chill of the ward seeped through her bones, mingling with the more subtle, creeping cold that had already begun to claim her world. London, she realized, had learned a new form of discipline, one that did not need to speak aloud. It simply waited, watched, and let the frost do the rest. The ward's gas lamps sputtered against the encroaching gloom, yet it was not their weak light that cast the most persistent shadows. Eleanor followed Dr. Whitmore down a narrow corridor, past doors that rattled softly with the movements of the patients within, until they reached a smaller chamber, a room set apart from the regimented rows of beds. Its single window was narrow and fogged with condensation, the pane catching the faintest glimmer from a candle perched on the corner of a polished table. Here, the atmosphere was different, warmer, yet heavy with the scent of wax and antiseptic, mingled with a hint of sweat and fear. The walls, once pristine, were shadowed and worn, as though the room itself had absorbed decades of whispered confessions and half-spoken truths. Dr. Whitmore gestured toward the chair in the center. Eleanor lowered herself slowly, aware of the candlelight dancing across her pallid skin. The flickering flame cast long shadows, bending the lines of her hand, stretching the contours of the numb patch into something almost grotesque, as if the light sought to exaggerate the absence of sensation. He seated himself across from her, resting his elbows on his knees, eyes tracing her carefully. There was no malice in his gaze, but a weighty hesitation, the sort that spoke of knowledge too complex to deliver lightly. "Miss Price," he began, voice low, almost a whisper, "you must understand what I am about to say is difficult, but you deserve honesty." He paused, as if the candle itself demanded reverence for the words. "This condition, it is not ordinary. The loss of sensation, the pallor, these are signs that cannot be ignored, no matter how gentle our attempts to shelter you from the world." Eleanor's chest tightened. She had braced for cold efficiency, clinical assessment, but not this, a human acknowledgement of what the city could not admit aloud. "I have seen many illnesses," he continued, leaning forward, the candlelight highlighting the lines in his face, the tired grey in his eyes. "Typhus, consumption, smallpox, all have their patterns, their marks, but what you exhibit—" He trailed off, eyes lowered, tracing the edges of his notebook with a gloved fingertip. "It is rare. It carries consequences beyond mere treatment. The city, the neighbors, they will see what I must acknowledge here first." Eleanor's lips parted. "Consequences?" He lifted his gaze, full and careful, not meeting hers completely, as though he feared contaminating her hope. "Isolation," he said, the word heavy, like the toll of a distant bell. "Exile from your community, even from your family. And yet," he faltered, rubbing his hand across his forehead, leaving faint streaks of soot and candle wax. "And yet, compassion dictates our care. I cannot condone cruelty, but the city, it will act regardless of my intentions." She shivered. The candlelight flickered. the shadow of the flame dancing across the pale patch on her hand, exaggerating its emptiness, turning it into a silent accusation. "I wish I could promise you mercy," he whispered, leaning back, the chair creaking beneath him. "But mercy is often reserved for those who do not inspire fear. And fear, Miss Price, is what spreads fastest in London." Her throat constricted. "So I am to be punished for what I carry." The doctor's hands tightened into fists on his knees. "Not punished," he said softly, "but observed, controlled, managed. The city has mechanisms, rigid and merciless. And sometimes those mechanisms are mistaken for judgment." He exhaled slowly, the candle reflecting in his eyes. "I must confess to you, the truth is harsher than the tests. The needle pricks, the swabs, the charts, they mean nothing in the face of how society perceives you. They measure your body, but they cannot measure the fear that will follow." Eleanor pressed her free hand to her lips, trembling. She understood the clinical procedures, the evaluations, were trivial compared to the scrutiny she would endure outside the walls of the ward, among a population ready to judge and exile her before any verdict could be formalized. Dr. Whitmore rose, resting a careful hand on the back of his chair. "Rest now," he said. "Gather what courage you may. Tomorrow will be another day, another series of observations. But know this, you are not unseen, nor entirely abandoned. I will record truthfully. I will treat you gently, and, for what that is worth, I am sorry for the world that will not." The candle flickered again, casting shadows that seemed to curl and whisper in the corners. Eleanor sat in the quiet, listening to the soft hum of the ward outside, the faint shuffle of feet along the corridors, and the unspoken confession that the surgeon had left with her. That London's cruelty was rarely born of hatred, but of fear, a fear that could consume everything in its path, even the fragile hope of a single pale hand. By the time Eleanor returned to Whitechapel, the fog had thickened into a pall that pressed against the gas lamps, turning their light into trembling halos that cast long, wavering shadows on the cobblestones. The street seemed smaller, narrower, as though the buildings themselves had leaned inward in apprehension. The usual din of morning, the shouts of costermongers, the rattle of coal carts, the squeal of children racing to school had vanished. The city was silent, not from calm, but from dread. Eleanor's steps echoed unnaturally loud as she navigated the narrow thoroughfare. She noticed the empty market stalls, their wares untouched, dusted with the residue of yesterday's frost. The baker's boy, usually shouting his wares with enthusiasm, stood inside the doorway, peering out with cautious eyes, his mouth moving as if to speak, then closing without sound. Even the stray cats, normally prowling and weaving between legs, crouched low in the corners, ears flattened, as if aware of the tension that hung in the mist. The street had emptied itself, a subtle exodus not driven by command, but by instinct. Londoners had learned, through whispers and rumour, to recognize danger before it was spoken aloud. A pale hand, a hidden patch of numb skin, a whispered report, these were enough to make neighbours vanish behind doors, curtains drawn tight, hearts racing behind walls. Eleanor slowed her pace, sensing the invisible current that had pulled the street into silence. She passed the corner where Mrs. Bramley's shopfront usually stood open, fragrant with dried herbs and the faint sweetness of tea. Now the windows were shuttered, a strip of yellowed tape across the frame marking absence. The door was locked, though no sign of theft or damage remained. The message was clear: keep away. Even proximity had become a hazard. Her own reflection in the window caught her by surprise. The face staring back at her was pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve, the flickering gaslight casting uneven shadows across her cheekbones. She turned away quickly, sensing the judgment of invisible eyes pressing upon her. The street seemed to recoil in tandem, folding in upon itself in the quiet orchestration of avoidance. A distant clatter broke the hush. Eleanor turned, hoping for human presence. but it was only the rattle of a cart's loose wheel, abandoned or left behind by a hurried vendor. The sound echoed down the alleyways, hollow and accusing. Each echo seemed to whisper her name, marking her as different, untouchable, and suspect. Children, who normally ran and shrieked in reckless delight, were nowhere in sight. Their absence was a small, sharp grief, a reminder that the street had been cleansed not of debris or filth, but of life. In the faintest corner of her mind, Eleanor felt the weight of their absence pressing against her ribs, a physical ache that no blanket or shawl could soothe. She reached the end of the row, her footsteps slowing, heart hammering with the realization that the entire neighborhood had adjusted its rhythm around her, or perhaps around what she represented. It was not illness alone that emptied the street, but the invisible fear of the unknown, the ancient dread of contagion, and the very human terror of social exclusion. Eleanor paused beneath the flickering glow of a lamp, watching the fog curl along the edges of cobblestones like silent fingers. She lifted her hand, paled and numb, and considered the city around her. London had learned to move around her, to bend, to contract, and to avoid. Every shuttered window, every silent doorway, every hidden gaze was a testament to its cautious vigilance. And in that realization, Eleanor understood. She had become both presence and absence, a ghost walking among the living. The street that had once been her familiar path had emptied itself not of commerce or work, but of comfort, of familiarity, of life that once acknowledged her as part of its rhythm. Tonight, the city would breathe again, but she would continue to move through it as a shadow, measured, observed, and, above all, avoided. By the time Eleanor returned from the workhouse, the division in Whitechapel had become tangible, almost physical, as though the city itself had erected invisible barriers between the afflicted and the rest. The fog hung low and suffocating, curling around lampposts like white tendrils that sought to fence the streets off from life. The air smelled faintly of soot, damp wool, and the sharp sting of carbolic that lingered from the workhouse's long corridors. Every inhalation reminded Eleanor that the world outside her narrow room had shifted irrevocably. Neighbors did not avoid her in ways that could be named or scolded. They did not confront her with shouts, nor did they bar doors with obvious malice. No, the city had learned subtler means of exclusion. A glance withheld, a door closed too quickly, a step across the street. Each gesture was small, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet together they formed a lattice of fear that Eleanor felt with every step. She walked the familiar path along Whitechapel Row, aware of the palpable space between herself and those she passed. Vendors shifted their carts, leaning away from her presence. Children on errands stopped mid-step and lowered their eyes. Women in the doorways clutched shawls across their chests, their murmured words muffled, their curiosity veiled beneath habit and caution. A man passing with a basket of coal tipped it slightly to block her way, as if the weight of the coals could create a buffer against contamination, real or imagined. Eleanor's hand, still pale and numb, remained folded beneath her shawl, a silent signal of difference. She dared not reveal it, for the city had become a hive of observation, every gesture noted, every movement scrutinized. A single slip, a visible tremor, or the accidental brush of a sleeve could amplify the whispers already circulating. She carries it. She has been marked. Stay back. And so Eleanor walked cautiously, her senses attuned to the invisible currents that guided each step she took. The street seemed to pulse with a new rhythm, a rhythm dictated not by commerce, nor by routine, but by fear. Gas lamps flickered above, their feeble light revealing the shapes of neighbors who had chosen distance over recognition. The physical world had become a mirror of the social one, each individual aware of boundaries too subtle to define, yet sharp enough to be felt. Eleanor sensed it in the weight of eyes turned away, in the slight recoil of shoulders, in the whispered conversations halted mid-phrase. She paused at the corner where the baker's shop stood, its door firmly shut and bolted. Through the frosted glass, she glimpsed his hand pressed against the counter, still and hesitant. Outside, a few passers-by shuffled past in a careful arc, widening the street as if to avoid even the possibility of contact. Eleanor realized then that London was no longer a city of people and houses. It had become a lattice of fear and avoidance, an organism that had learned to separate itself from the infected without ever needing a law or proclamation. And yet, in the midst of this invisible segregation, Eleanor felt the sharp sting of loneliness more than the chill of frost. She had become both part of the city and apart from it, a presence tolerated in theory but feared in practice. Every touch withheld, every glance avoided, every footstep redirected reinforced a truth that the workhouse, the inspections, and the whispers had already begun to teach. In London, illness was not merely a disease of the body, but a condition that reshaped every human connection, dividing streets, families, and even hearts by the simplest, cruelest measure of all touch. Eleanor walked on, the fog curling higher around her like the hands of an unseen audience. She could not pass unnoticed, nor could she retreat. London had drawn its lines, and she now knew that between the living and the feared, a chasm had opened, invisible, yet impossible to cross. The carriage arrived before the first light had broken over Whitechapel, its wheels crunching softly against frost-hardened cobblestones. It was a municipal vehicle, plain and grey, with narrow slits for windows and a door that closed with a muted, final click. No embellishments marked it as anything but official. No adornments betrayed compassion. Its arrival alone drew attention not from curiosity, but from dread. Eleanor stood on the doorstep of her tenement, shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, fingers hidden beneath the folds. The pale patch on her hand remained concealed, yet she could feel the weight of the city pressing through the fabric of her own skin. Across the street, gas lamps flickered in the lingering fog, illuminating the shuttered windows of neighbors who had risen quietly, drawn to their panes to witness the unseen rituals of fear. The driver, a man in a thick coat and cap, doffed his hat briefly, a gesture perfunctory and mechanical. Behind him, the carriage's interior awaited a cold, shadowed space where light flickered dimly from a single lantern. Inspector Lemming, already present, nodded for Eleanor to enter. She stepped forward, each motion measured, aware that her every gesture would be scrutinized not only by those within the carriage but by the street itself. Once inside, the door closed with a soft, echoing thud. The confined space smelled faintly of damp leather and lingering coal smoke, and the chill of the morning seeped in despite the small lantern. Eleanor lowered herself onto the narrow bench, glancing at the inspector seated opposite her. His iron clipboard rested on his knees, fingers drumming lightly, each tap echoing against the walls of the carriage. He did not speak, yet his presence was suffocating, an embodiment of the authority that had begun to dominate her days. The carriage lurched forward, rolling through streets, emptied of their usual morning clamour. Eleanor's eyes traced the passing facades, the shuttered bakeries, the darkened windows of families who had chosen precaution over humanity, alleys where children no longer played. The fog seemed to lean in closer, curling around the corners of buildings, obscuring the familiar from her view, transforming the city into a ghostly landscape. Every step of the horses, every rattle of the wheels over cobblestones, punctuated the silence, a rhythm that measured not distance, but inevitability. She thought of Margaret Hale, the seamstress who had vanished from Whitechapel Row with only whispers and shuttered doors to mark her passage. Eleanor's throat tightened at the memory. That disappearance had been a warning, a proof of what fear could achieve even before law or physician intervened. She realized that the carriage, this cold, grey vehicle, was more than transport, it was a conveyor of inevitability, carrying her toward a future already measured, weighed, and anticipated by the machinery of the city. Inspector Lemming shifted, finally breaking the silence. "Miss Price," he said quietly, his tone as cold and measured as the frost clinging to the streets outside. "The board has requested your presence for full evaluation. Their procedures are standard, but compliance is mandatory." He tapped the edge of his clipboard. "This will ensure the safety of both yourself and the community. You will be under observation until further notice." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Her voice had abandoned her under the weight of anticipation, leaving only the sound of her pulse in her ears. The city pressed closer through the carriage walls, its fog and silence a constant companion, reminding her that she was not merely traveling, she was being carried into the heart of its judgment. Outside, the lamps blurred, melting into the fog like dying stars. Inside, the lantern flickered, casting long shadows over Eleanor's pale-covered hand. She could not feel the frost beneath the shawl, nor the weight of her own apprehension. Yet she knew, with a certainty sharper than any pain, that by dawn she would no longer be merely a resident of Whitechapel. She would be an object of observation, a subject of fear, a vessel for the city's meticulous and unfeeling attention. And as the carriage carried her through the empty streets, Eleanor understood the truth of the morning. The journey was not to a place of care, but to a threshold where her life, her identity, and her very presence would be measured, weighed, and divided by the invisible hands of London's relentless vigilance. The carriage rattled through streets that seemed unnaturally empty, past buildings that leaned into the fog as if to shield themselves from what they carried. Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the narrow slits of the window, through which the city's gas lamps smeared the morning light into pale, trembling streaks. Each shadow that flickered across the glass seemed to echo a warning she could not name, and the numbness in her left hand felt heavier, as though it bore the weight of every glance, every whispered judgment she had endured. At last, the carriage slowed and came to a halt before a high grey wall topped with wrought iron. Beyond it, Eleanor could discern a small courtyard, cobbled and precise, its edges rigid with control. The matron who had guided her from the ward opened the carriage door and gestured inside, her movements efficient, devoid of comfort. Eleanor stepped down onto the frost-laced stones, the chill biting through her boots, her shawl, and her apprehension. "This is the East London Auxiliary Workhouse," the matron said, her voice clipped and firm. "The facility will house you until your full evaluation is complete. Your room is ready." She did not linger. "Follow me." Eleanor obeyed, her steps careful, measuring the space between herself and the others. Beyond the courtyard, a narrow corridor led to a flight of stairs descending into the heart of the institution. The walls were bare, the air heavy with antiseptic, and the faint smell of carbolic clung to everything like a ghost of cleanliness. Eleanor noticed the other occupants, pale figures moving silently, some walking with a deliberate care, others huddled against the walls. They watched her with a mixture of curiosity, fear, and quiet resignation, and she realized immediately that she had arrived not in a place of comfort, but in a threshold between worlds. Her room was small, almost austere, furnished only with a single bed, a narrow table, and a chair. The window, frosted and high above the courtyard, allowed no view of the city outside. Eleanor sat upon the edge of the bed, her hands folded carefully in her lap, feeling the cold through the fabric of her gloves. In this room, she was both seen and unseen, acknowledged and yet suspended in a liminal space. She was not merely a patient, she was a specimen, a subject under scrutiny, a resident of a place that had become known among its occupants as the Island of the Unnamed. The nickname was whispered in corridors, spoken only behind curtains or between teeth, carried from room to room as a warning. Those sent here were never discussed outside these walls. They existed in the margins of the city's awareness, removed from the rhythms of daily life, and their names often vanished before the ink of any record could fully dry. Eleanor's heart ached with the knowledge that, should she remain, her own name might dissolve into the silence that cloaked the institution. A nurse entered, her gloves tapping softly against the narrow table as she prepared the instruments for Eleanor's evaluation. The candle on the table flickered in a draught that was both physical and spectral, casting shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls and reach toward Eleanor's pale, numb hand. She watched the nurse move, each action precise, measured, devoid of emotion, and felt a sudden, overwhelming isolation. "This is your new home for the time being," the nurse said quietly. "Follow the rules, remain in your room when instructed, and you will not be harmed. You are here for observation, nothing more." Eleanor nodded, understanding the double meaning. The ward's strictness was not merely for hygiene or medical protocol. It was a place where fear was administered carefully, invisibly, and where lives could be contained as efficiently as disease. She sat quietly as the nurse departed, listening to the faint creak of floorboards beyond her door. The fog outside pressed against the high window, and Eleanor realized that this island of the unnamed was both a physical and social exile. Here, the city's fear was concentrated, measured, and meticulous. Here, she had become more than a patient. She had become a symbol, a living testament to the city's relentless vigilance and its capacity to isolate what it could not control. And in the cold silence of the room, Eleanor understood that the island of the unnamed was not merely a place. It was a warning, a threshold, and a reminder that London's judgment was as invisible as it was inescapable. Eleanor had grown accustomed to the oppressive hush of the workhouse, yet each day brought with it a renewed awareness of how thoroughly the institution claimed her. She awoke in the grey pre-dawn light, the frost clinging to the window pane like brittle lace, and immediately felt the weight of the matron's gaze. Matron Hargrove, as she had learned her name, was a figure of authority so absolute that even the shadows in the corners of the ward seemed to bow in deference. She moved with the precision of a metronome, footsteps measured, gloves tapping lightly against railings, keys jangling at her side like a sinister melody. The matron's face was a landscape of stern angles and taut skin. Her lips rarely parted in anything resembling warmth, and when they did, it was merely to deliver commands with a clipped cadence. Eleanor had never seen her smile, and she had begun to wonder whether the muscles of her mouth had simply forgotten the motion. There was a rumor among the patients that Matron Hargrove had smiled once, decades prior, when the ward was empty of new arrivals, and that the memory had been preserved only in whispered tales. Eleanor could not decide whether she envied or feared such an expression. The morning routine commenced with a solemnity that could have been ceremonial. Matron Hargrove appeared in the doorway at precisely 6 o'clock, torch in hand, illuminating the rows of beds. Her eyes swept over the ward, noting each occupant's posture, the placement of blankets, the slight tremor in a hand, the subtle twitch of a foot. Eleanor, seated on the edge of her own bed, felt the matron's gaze pierce her skin, as though the numb patch on her hand might betray her presence to a higher authority if observed too closely. "You will rise," Matron Hargrove instructed, her voice void of inflection, yet carrying the weight of expectation. "Breakfast will follow immediately. Do not dawdle. Your examination will not be delayed for idleness." Eleanor obeyed, standing slowly, aware that any misstep could draw subtle yet unmistakable disapproval. The matron did not accompany them to the dining area, yet her presence lingered in every step, in the careful placement of trays, in the hushed whispers among the patients. Her authority was absolute, a force that maintained order not through conversation or compassion, but through the quiet intimidation of an unyielding figure. After breakfast, Eleanor was instructed to remain in her bed while the matron performed rounds. Hargrove's approach was silent at first, only the faint tap of boots against the polished floor betrayed her movement. She stopped at Eleanor's bedside, gloved fingers inspecting the patch of numb skin as if it were an artifact rather than part of a human being. The matron did not speak, merely noted in her small ledger with precise, deliberate strokes. "You will remain under observation," she stated at last, her voice soft, almost as if the words themselves were measured to avoid unnecessary cruelty. Yet even in her softness, there was no trace of comfort. "Your conduct will be noted. Any deviation from routine will be addressed." Eleanor nodded, though she felt the weight of the room pressing down upon her shoulders. There was no room for resistance here. Her body, her hand, her very presence were under continuous evaluation. The matron's vigilance was not vindictive. It was a calculated assertion of control, an unspoken lesson that within these walls, fear and discipline were more potent than any medicine. As the matron moved on, Eleanor allowed herself a brief exhale, the air carrying the faint, lingering scent of carbolic. The ward seemed to contract once more, folding the silence around her like a physical force. Every eye, every whispered movement, every shiver of fabric along the beds seemed to reflect the same truth. The matron would not smile, the city outside would not pause, and Eleanor had entered a space where survival was measured not by courage, but by compliance. She lowered her gaze to her hands, the numbness stretching outward like frost creeping across a window pane. In the presence of the matron who would not smile, Eleanor understood that this ward was not simply a place of care. It was a crucible, testing both body and spirit, and that the lessons it imparted were as cold and unyielding as the frost pressed against the glass. The days in the workhouse passed in a rhythm measured by routines and restraint, each one indistinguishable from the last, save for the slight variations in the chill of the corridors and the number of footsteps that echoed along the stone floors. Eleanor had begun to internalize the silence, the frost that seemed to settle not only on the windows, but upon the nerves of every inhabitant. Yet, even as she adjusted to this liminal existence, a small hope persisted. That news from the outside, a note from her sister, or a letter delivered with care, might reach her, tethering her to the world she had been forced to leave behind. It was on a morning so grey that the sun seemed hesitant to rise that Eleanor received a small envelope slipped beneath her door by a quiet hand. The paper was plain, unremarkable, yet it carried the weight of human connection, a tether to her family, to the warmth of Whitechapel, to the fragile remnants of life beyond the ward. She recognized the handwriting at once. Mara, her sister had written, carefully folding the lines, pressing the ink so that it remained legible despite the haste with which it must have been written. Eleanor retrieved the letter, her pulse quickening. She unfolded it slowly, savoring the tactile sensation, the faint scent of pressed paper and ink. Her eyes scanned the words, assurances of care, updates on neighbors, small tales of life continuing in her absence. Each line was a lifeline, a reminder that the city outside had not entirely erased her existence. Yet, as she reached the final paragraph, her hands trembling beneath the folds of her shawl, she found something disquieting, a small official stamp across the corner of the paper. Return to sender. Undeliverable. Eleanor froze. The words seemed to scrape against the soft fabric of her chest, carrying a finality she could not ignore. Her sister's letter had not reached her. It had been intercepted, redirected, or refused. The envelope lay in her hands like a fragile shell, empty of the hope it had promised, hollowed by forces unseen, yet unmistakably present. She turned it over, searching for an explanation. There was none. The return stamp bore no name, no mark of justification, only the sterile assertion that communication would not reach her. The handwriting, so familiar and intimate, had been nullified by bureaucracy and fear. Her thoughts drifted immediately to the neighbors who whispered in hallways, the officials who moved through the corridors of the workhouse, and the inspectors who had escorted her here in the first place. Every step had been calculated, every glance noted, and now, Even the tender, human act of sending a letter had been denied. The city outside had reasserted its dominion, ensuring that Eleanor remained not only physically isolated, but severed from the comforting tendrils of family and familiarity. She sat on the narrow bed, cradling the envelope as though it were a living thing, and felt a wave of grief that went beyond words. In this ward, letters meant less than the cold, the shadows, and the vigilant eyes that recorded her every movement. Each return, each denial, was a reaffirmation of her exile, a quiet decree that she existed now solely within the boundaries defined by fear, routine, and surveillance. The candle flickered, its light casting trembling shadows across the walls. Eleanor's mind traced the paths her sister's words might have taken, imagining the hands that intercepted them, the eyes that judged them. Every thwarted attempt at connection reinforced the lesson she had been learning since her arrival, that in London, exile was as much social and emotional as it was physical. And so, with the returned letter folded neatly atop her bedside table, Eleanor leaned back against the cold mattress. She understood with bitter clarity that communication itself had been measured, weighed, and controlled. Even words could not escape the city's mechanisms. In the silence of the ward, she resolved to endure, knowing that every unopened letter, every withheld connection, was a reminder of the world that had chosen to observe her from afar rather than embrace her presence, a world whose judgment was as cold and unyielding as the frost pressing against the windows of the island of the unnamed. Eleanor had learned, over the uncounted hours of her confinement, that survival within the ward depended as much on ritual as on restraint. Every gesture, every placement of cloth, every careful fold of fabric carried significance. It was in this world of subtle observations and muted actions that she discovered the quiet power of the handkerchief, a small, seemingly inconsequential piece of linen that could serve as a shield, a token, and a tether to the life she had once known. She carried it constantly, folded and pressed into the inside pocket of her gown, a private possession that no one could confiscate without intention. To anyone else, it might appear ordinary, a thin, faded piece of fabric embroidered with delicate stitches, frayed at the edges, its original scent nearly vanished. But for Eleanor, it was a talisman against the invisible architecture of fear that surrounded her, a reminder that a fragment of normality could still exist even in the hollowed walls of the workhouse. The ward was quiet that morning, as it often was before the examinations began. Matron Hargrove had passed through earlier, her steps measured, the jangle of keys echoing like distant bells. Each patient moved cautiously, anticipating the matron's gaze even when it was absent, aligning themselves along the rhythms dictated by authority. Eleanor adjusted the handkerchief in her pocket, ensuring it was not visible, and took a slow, deliberate breath. The linen smelled faintly of lavender, and cloth pressed in times when life had been easier, simpler, warmer. The sound of footsteps approached deliberate, unhurried, yet impossibly precise. Dr. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, gloved hands ready, notebook in place. His eyes scanned the room, briefly resting on Eleanor before moving on, as if her very posture had been a test in obedience. She remained seated, fingers stilling on the edge of the bed, handkerchief secured within her pocket. The weight of its presence was comforting, yet it reminded her of the fragility of her existence, a small, private artifact in a place designed to strip the personal from every action. "Miss Price," Dr. Whitmore began, voice quiet yet imbued with authority, "we shall continue today's evaluation. It is imperative that you remain composed and that your responses be accurate." Eleanor nodded, the motion slight, almost imperceptible. She could feel the fabric of the handkerchief against her palm, a delicate reassurance that despite the prickling eyes of other patients, the matron's unyielding attention, and the cold scrutiny of the physician, a small piece of her life remained untouched. the doctor proceeded with the sensory tests. Each prick of the needle, each brush of cold metal, each application of gauze and ice was recorded meticulously. Eleanor's left hand, the hand marked by numbness, remained indifferent to the stimuli. The matron watched from the doorway, keys jingling softly, her expression unreadable. Throughout it all, the handkerchief stayed folded, pressed to her side, a silent witness to the procedures. It had never left her possession, and in that constancy, Eleanor found a measure of defiance. The ward could strip her of comfort, autonomy, and ease of movement, yet it could not touch the small, intimate rituals she carried within herself. When the evaluation concluded, she returned to her bed, the candlelight flickering over the folds of linen pressed into her pocket. The handkerchief, modest in appearance yet immense in its quiet significance, had become more than fabric. It was memory, resistance, and reassurance, all at once. Eleanor traced its outline beneath the folds of her gown, realizing that in this ward in the island of the unnamed, among walls of carbolic and frost, survival might not depend solely on obedience, but on the preservation of small, private acts. The handkerchief never left her pocket, and through it she retained a thread of her former life, a quiet promise that some part of her identity could endure. No matter how fiercely London's fear and silence pressed against her, the streets outside Whitechapel were waking slowly, the fog curling in restless tendrils along the cobblestones, pressing itself against doors, windows, and the thin shoulders of those still brave enough to walk before sunrise. Eleanor had returned briefly to her tenement, summoned by the matron for administrative formalities, and now found herself outside once more, moving under the pale, flickering light of gas lamps that struggled to pierce the damp morning haze. Each step echoed hollowly, swallowed by the shroud of fog, yet somehow Eleanor felt it magnified the weight of observation in every sound. A uniformed figure appeared ahead, one of the constables who patrolled the district, a man she had passed countless times, yet never truly noticed until now. His boots scuffed the wet stones in rhythm with the distant clatter of carts, but Eleanor noted immediately how his gaze moved not upon the street, nor upon the pedestrians, but trained above her head, along the facades of the buildings, the shop signs, the chimneys. His eyes flickered briefly toward her, only to look away almost instantly, as though acknowledgement itself carried danger. She slowed her pace, instinctively aware that the constable's deliberate avoidance was not indifference, but an act of subtle judgment. In this city, observation was as precise as measurement, and even the simplest glance, withheld or delivered, could define one's place in society. Eleanor's left hand remained tucked beneath her shawl, pale and inert, yet she felt it like a beacon under the inspector's averted gaze, the visible symbol of difference, the mark that prompted avoidance without word. The policeman's steps faltered as he passed her, a brief pause that did not last longer than a heartbeat, yet stretched across the street like an accusation. His shoulders straightened, and he continued onward, boots tapping the stones with an almost mechanical precision. Eleanor exhaled softly, though not a relief, only a recognition that the city itself had learned to accommodate fear. Streets were measured now, distance calculated with care, and even those charged with law enforcement understood the necessity of maintaining separation. Further down the road, shopkeepers had begun to open their shutters, yet they, too, practiced a careful choreography. Baskets were shifted slightly, windows were half closed, and greetings were delivered with clipped tones, never lingering long enough to encourage familiarity. Every gesture was a reinforcement of boundaries, a silent pact that those suspected of illness must be circumscribed, watched, and, if necessary, avoided entirely. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the workhouse, to Matron Hargrove and Dr. Whitmore, to the rows of beds and the meticulous recording of sensation and absence. Here, outside the controlled walls, the city continued the same lessons, less formally, yet just as relentlessly. Avoidance was the currency of survival, and recognition even of existence was a privilege reserved for those unmarked by suspicion. As she passed the corner of the lane, a child stumbled into the path of a delivery cart. The policeman stepped aside without looking, letting the wheel pass within inches of the boy. Eleanor noticed the care with which he measured his actions, aware that the child might be touched or brushed against. That proximity carried consequence. He had learned, as the city had, that certain presences demanded a buffer, a circumference measured not in feet, but in invisible decrees of fear and caution. By the time Eleanor reached the next block, she realized that the act of walking through the streets had become a ritual of endurance. Every glance withheld, every step carefully calculated. Every policeman who looked away was a reminder that she had been partitioned from the ordinary life of the city. She was both present and absent, a figure simultaneously acknowledged and denied, and London had learned to adjust itself around her as if she were a ghost among the living. The fog thickened again, swallowing the street and the averted gaze of the constable alike. Eleanor pulled her shawl closer, feeling the numb patch against her chest like a talisman of isolation, and understood with a stark certainty that the city, ever vigilant, would continue to measure her in the spaces between touch, glance, and acknowledgement, a silent, relentless tribunal from which there would be no reprieve. Within the confines of the workhouse, Eleanor found herself drawn once again to the room that smelled faintly of carbolic and stale air, a place where light trembled against the polished surfaces and shadows gathered in corners as if listening. This was Dr. Whitmore's domain, the physician's cabinet of bottles, a narrow chamber lined with shelves of glass vials and flasks, each one carefully labelled, each one a promise, a threat, or a record of human frailty. Here, the very air seemed to hum with observation, the weight of scrutiny pressing down with subtle insistence. Eleanor stood at the threshold, her shawl clutched around her, observing the rows of bottles arranged with meticulous precision. Amber, cobalt, and green glass glimmered in the candlelight, each reflecting the flicker as if the flames themselves had been trapped inside the vessel. Some were filled with tinctures, their contents floating like suspended spectres. Others were empty, their shadows cast long and distorted across the wooden shelves. The bottles were more than mere medicine, they were evidence, relics of experiments past, and markers of what the physician could control, measure, and contain. Dr. Whitmore moved silently among them, his gloved hands adjusting a vial here, replacing a stopper there, each action deliberate, precise. He did not glance at Eleanor until she spoke. "Doctor," she murmured, her voice soft, almost swallowed by the room's heavy air. "Are these for me?" He paused, fingers resting on a narrow shelf of green glass, and shook his head. "Not all, Miss Price. Some are for general use. Others—" his voice faltered slightly, and he straightened his back. "Others document observations, records of sensation, responses, and the absence of them. They are not for immediate treatment, but for study." Eleanor approached the shelves cautiously, the candlelight catching the edges of the glass. She noted a vial containing a pale, almost colorless liquid, suspended in faint motion as if stirred by some imperceptible breath. Another glimmered with deep amber, thick and viscous, like frozen sunlight. Each bottle seemed to pulse with its own quiet significance, each one a testament to the meticulous scrutiny that the city and its physicians demanded of those it deemed uncertain. "Why so many?" she asked, unable to mask the tremor in her voice. "Why catalogue everything so completely?" Dr. Whitmore turned, the candlelight casting sharp angles across his face. His expression was unreadable, a careful mask over the unease he could not entirely hide. "Because, Miss Price," he said, voice lowered, "ignorance is far more dangerous than observation. Each reaction, each lack of reaction, must be recorded. The absence of sensation is as vital as its presence, and in this ward, Precision is the only safeguard against mistakes. Eleanor's gaze fell to her own hand, the pale patch upon it hidden beneath her shawl but felt with relentless clarity. The bottles seemed to reflect her condition back at her, captured, measured, contained, yet powerless to restore what had been lost. She imagined her own responses charted in ink on paper, each prick, each brush, each test distilled into symbols, lines, and notes that could determine her fate long before mercy or compassion reached the equation. Dr. Whitmore adjusted another vial, noting something in a small ledger with gloved fingers. The candlelight flickered, casting elongated shadows across the bottles, and Eleanor saw, for a moment, the room transformed. It was no longer merely a cabinet, it was a gallery of human vulnerability, a museum of bodies and senses, catalogued for the scrutiny of authority. She shivered, the cold creeping through the folds of her shawl, not from the air but from the realization that these bottles, orderly, precise, and unfeeling, were a microcosm of the city itself. London, in its vigilance, measured and contained fear just as meticulously as Dr. Whitmore measured and contained sensation. Eleanor turned away, stepping back into the corridor where shadows still clung, and understood that in the physician's cabinet of bottles she had seen not only the instruments of medicine, but the architecture of isolation itself. Here, in this small, candle-lit room, the city's scrutiny had taken form, its careful, indifferent observation distilled into glass, ink, and the cold touch of a gloved hand. And she knew, with a certainty that made her stomach tighten, that this meticulous cataloguing was only the beginning. The ward was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that seemed to stretch outward, pressing against the walls and pooling in the corners like cold water. Eleanor sat on her narrow bed, the pale light of a single candle flickering against the frost-darkened window, watching the shadows of the ward sway with the occasional movement of nurses or patients. The hush was broken only by the soft, uneven breathing of those who had learned to exist in silence, and by the faint, deliberate footsteps of Matron Hargrove, moving as always with meticulous attention. A small figure appeared at the far end of the room, one of the younger patients, a boy no more than 8 or 9, with wide, anxious eyes and fingers that twisted the hem of his threadbare garment. He had been placed in the ward weeks before Eleanor's arrival, yet she had scarcely spoken to him. Words in this place were weighed against consequence, and curiosity could be dangerous. Yet now the child approached, tentative, as though each step risked collapse, and stopped before her bed. "Miss," he began, voice barely audible above the soft creak of the floorboards. "Miss Eleanor, can I ask you something?" Eleanor nodded, careful to keep her own voice low. "Yes," she said softly. "What is it?" "Is it winter?" he asked, a question so simple it seemed almost absurd. He gestured to the frost-caked window, where pale light struggled against the fog, and the edges of the panes were etched with patterns that looked like ice-laden lace. "Outside, I mean. Is it really winter? Or are we always here?" Eleanor felt the words settle over her like a shroud. The child's gaze was earnest, innocent, yet weighted by a fear that had taken residence long before he had understood its source. She realized, with a pang, that the boy had come to associate the frost and cold not with the season, but with the ward itself, its unyielding routines, its antiseptic chill, and the subtle, relentless sense of isolation that defined life here. "Yes," she replied carefully. "It is winter outside, though it seems different in here." Her voice carried the faintest tremor, betraying the empathy she struggled to suppress. Frost and snow exist beyond these walls, where the air is freer and not weighed down by this place. The boy's eyes widened slightly, hope flickering within the dim light. Can you see it? The snow?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, I cannot. But I know it is there, and the world beyond these walls still exists, it still moves and breathes. He looked down, twisting his small hands together, the gesture delicate and anxious. I thought everything stopped when you come here. That life stops for everyone. She reached out, careful not to touch his numb, trembling fingers, and spoke with measured warmth. Life does not stop, but fear changes how we experience it. Here we are measured, watched, and observed, and it makes the world seem smaller than it really is. But outside, beyond these walls, the streets are still alive, the snow still falls, and people still walk through it. The child's lips parted in a small, almost imperceptible exhale. He leaned slightly closer, curiosity and longing mingling in his gaze. Eleanor saw reflected in his eyes a fragment of what she herself had once felt before fear had begun to govern every movement, every glance, every heartbeat. A faint knock at the door startled them both, Matron Hargrove coming to remind Eleanor of the pending examination. The boy retreated, shuffling back toward his own bed, glancing over his shoulder as though fearful that even the smallest moment of connection might be forbidden. Eleanor watched him vanish into the shadows, the candlelight flickering across the frost-laden window. She understood, in that quiet instant, that the child's question had not merely been about the season. It had been about existence, continuity, and hope, the fragile truths that the ward sought to suppress, one measured, careful step at a time. And as she prepared herself to follow the matron once more, Eleanor realized that even in a place designed to isolate, the human spirit, curious, questioning, and persistent, could still pierce the cold, like the first faint light of winter sun upon frozen ground. The approach of Christmas, which in years past had brought the faintest warmth to the heart of Whitechapel, arrived this year as a muted shadow. Outside the workhouse walls, gas lamps flickered through the drifting fog, illuminating streets empty of the usual bustle. No children ran with shouts, no carolers braved the chill to trade song for coin, and shop windows remained shuttered, their painted holly and wreaths hidden behind boards that seemed to guard against more than theft. The city had learned caution in the harshest terms, and for Eleanor and the ward's occupants, the season's joy was absent not from lack of desire, but from the pervasive fear that even the smallest movement might carry consequence. Inside the ward, the air was colder than usual, sharpened by antiseptic and the subtle draught that pressed against the frosted windows. Candles flickered on each table, their flames subdued, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. The faint scent of wax, mingled with the lingering tang of carbolic, gave the room a permanent chill, as though the very atmosphere sought to suppress cheer. Eleanor sat on the edge of her narrow bed, hands folded carefully over her shawl, her left hand hidden beneath the fabric. The numbness, unyielding and precise, had become a constant companion, a marker of difference that the ward itself seemed to acknowledge with unspoken gravity. She listened closely. Normally, the ward carried a low hum, the subtle shuffle of shoes, the whispered exchange of words, the soft clatter of metal utensils during meal service. But today, there was only silence. Not the silence of peace, but of absence. Every sound was measured, every motion restrained, as though the very walls had been trained to suppress noise and, by extension, hope. It was a silence that carried the weight of expectation. The residents, like her, understood that in this season, any joy might draw the wrong attention, might mark them further for scrutiny. The matron moved through the ward as always, her footsteps precise and unyielding. Each bed was inspected, blankets arranged, instruments checked, and the rules of observation reiterated with quiet authority. No smile softened her face, no gesture offered reassurance. Christmas here had been reduced to ritual, lights flickering without warmth, careful routines performed without deviation, and the awareness of fear pressing upon every resident, heavy as frost on the window pane. Eleanor thought of her own family, of the small comforts that had once marked the season. A wreath on the door, the scent of simmering broth, the soft murmur of voices gathered together. Here, those rituals were absent, replaced by the sterile precision of the ward, where warmth and laughter had no place. Even the children, usually carriers of cheer, remained quiet and still, their innocence tempered by the vigilance required of survival. She reached for the small handkerchief in her pocket, folding it neatly against her chest. It was the only personal possession she could claim a talisman against the frost that pressed against her from every angle, tangible and invisible. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the faint flicker of candles in her old home, the muffled sound of footsteps in corridors not governed by fear, the laughter that belonged to families untouched by the meticulous attention of inspectors and matron alike. The ward remained still. The city, beyond the frosted windows, remained silent. Eleanor understood with a piercing clarity that Christmas-like life itself had been measured, weighed, and curtailed by fear. There would be no footsteps to herald joy, no songs to carry warmth, no hearth to invite solace. Yet in that silence, she resolved, a fragment of defiance stirred. Though London, the ward, and the observers might measure her body, her hand, and her responses, they could not claim her memory of Christmas, nor extinguish the small, private light that persisted in the corners of her mind, the stubborn, human hope that even in the coldest, quietest winter, she had survived, and would survive still. The day the diagnosis arrived, Eleanor's tenement felt smaller, more suffocating, as though the walls themselves had drawn inward to witness the consequences of knowledge. The letter, hand-delivered under the pretense of civility, bore the seal of the East London Contagion Board, a pale, official mark that carried the gravity of irrevocable judgment. Eleanor held it in her hands, the paper crinkling faintly beneath her trembling fingers. She could feel the numb patch along her knuckles, a phantom echo of the words that were about to determine the shape of her existence. Inside, her sister Mara moved cautiously through the cramped room, her eyes darting toward Eleanor, as though seeking reassurance that the document might not bear its lethal weight. Outside, the city's fog pressed against the windows, grey and unyielding, mirroring the tension within. A candle flickered on the table, casting long shadows that seemed to slither across the floorboards, reaching toward every corner, every secret, every whispered hope that remained. Eleanor's hands shook as she broke the seal. The words within were precise, clinical, and devastating. Her condition was confirmed: leprosy. The phrasing was careful, almost detached, yet its implications were clear. Isolation, observation, removal from society, and the constant scrutiny of authorities now defined the terms of her life. The document made no appeal to emotion, no promise of comfort. It was fact, and fact was absolute. Mara's breath caught. She reached for Eleanor's hand, but Eleanor instinctively withdrew, conscious of the numbness that betrayed her to the world. The gesture, intended as comfort, became a reminder of the distance fear had erected between them. Mara's lips trembled. "Eleanor, what will we do?" she whispered, voice small and fragile against the oppressive quiet of the room. Eleanor could not answer. Words failed her. They had always failed in moments when the city itself seemed to weigh upon her chest. She stared at the pale lines on her hand, tracing the outline of numbness as though it could offer guidance. The diagnosis was more than a medical fact, it was a social verdict, a reconfiguration of her family, her home, her very identity. In the hallway, neighbors moved with unusual caution, peering briefly from behind curtains, then retreating. Their steps, muffled and deliberate, formed a silent chorus that mirrored the decree now held in Eleanor's hands. The city itself had already begun to enforce the isolation that the board codified in ink. It was not only the disease that confined her, but the expectations and fears of everyone who had ever lived beside her. The household shifted around the weight of the news. Mara's hands shook as she replaced the kettle on the stove, its whistle muted by trembling fingers. The small parlor, once a place of warmth and conversation, seemed hollow, every object infused with the inevitability of absence. Eleanor's gaze fell upon the empty mantel, the space where the family portrait had once stood now erased, a silent testament to what fear and suspicion could remove before any law intervened. Eleanor's chest ached with a quiet, relentless sorrow. She understood that the diagnosis did not merely define her health, it redefined her family's interactions, their daily routines, their ability to exist comfortably in the spaces they had long occupied. Meals were eaten in silence, footsteps measured, whispers hushed. The walls themselves seemed to carry the weight of judgment, amplifying each hesitation, each careful motion. And in that crushing clarity, Eleanor realized that the true fracture was not in her own body, nor in the letter she held, but in the household itself. The diagnosis had done its work before any removal could be enforced. It had broken the rhythm of home, instilled a vigilance that poisoned simple comfort, and reshaped a family into fragments bound together only by fear and duty. As the candle guttered in the draught, Eleanor folded the letter and placed it carefully on the table. Outside, London remained indifferent, grey and watchful. Inside, the household held its collective breath, the silence now absolute a reflection of the city's judgment and a testament to the quiet cruelty of certainty. Eleanor understood, with the full weight of inevitability pressing against her ribs, that the board's verdict was not merely on paper. It had already taken residence in the walls, in the hearts of those she loved, and in the very air she breathed. The diagnosis was complete. The household, fragile and constrained, would never again be the same. In the dimly lit laboratory at the heart of the East London Contagion Board, the microscope sat like a sentinel of truth, polished metal glinting faintly beneath the gaslight. Its lenses captured more than light. They held the capacity to expose every hidden detail, every imperceptible variation, every whisper of disease invisible to the untrained eye. Eleanor watched from the narrow doorway, escorted by Dr. Whitmore, as the young physician adjusted the focus, the brass knobs clicking with deliberate precision. The room smelled of carbolic, alcohol, and the faint, lingering odor of human presence, the residue of countless tests, samples, and observations. Shelves lined with vials, slides, and instruments reflected the flickering light like a constellation of meticulous knowledge. Each object seemed to hum with expectation, as though the very air anticipated revelation. Eleanor's hand remained folded beneath her shawl, the numb patch pressing softly against the fabric, a subtle reminder of the limitations of the senses. Dr. Whitmore gestured toward the microscope. "This," he said quietly, "will allow us to see what cannot be felt. It will reveal the cause of your condition, the organism that moves silently beneath the skin. It is a truth that is both precise and merciless." Eleanor nodded, though her throat felt tight, her chest pressed by the anticipation of another form of scrutiny. She had endured observation in the ward, examinations by needle and touch, assessments of her posture, her movement, her reaction to cold and pressure. Yet here, in the quiet hum of the laboratory, she felt exposed in a new way, reduced to tissue, to sample, to evidence, under the unblinking gaze of science. Dr. Whitmore prepared the slide, placing a sample of tissue onto the polished glass with meticulous care. The liquid medium shimmered, reflecting the lamp in small, dancing sparks of light. Eleanor held her breath as he adjusted the focus, first broad, then narrow, until the smallest details emerged with startling clarity. Through the microscope, the world transformed. What had seemed ordinary, even invisible, was revealed in sharp relief. the organism that caused her numbness, moving slowly beneath the surface, a pale, almost imperceptible presence, yet potent enough to alter the course of life itself. Eleanor stared at the image, the truth laid bare in black and white shapes, precise and unyielding. There was no charm, no mercy, no hope of concealment. Science, in its brilliance, had stripped away ambiguity. "The bacteria," Dr. Whitmore murmured, voice soft, almost reverent, "are present. Their form is unmistakable. They are the agents of the disease you carry, silent, persistent, and methodical. The city fears what is invisible, yet here it is, captured for study, undeniable in its presence." Eleanor's breath caught. The numbness of her hand seemed mirrored in her heart, a sensation absent, yet present in its oppressive weight. She had long understood that the workhouse, the inspectors, the matron, and the board measured her reactions, her compliance, and her worth. But now, even the instruments of science itself had declared the truth. Dr. Whitmore removed the slide, covering it with a small, protective case. He recorded his observations with careful handwriting, each notation an indelible trace of her existence and condition. Eleanor watched the meticulous process, realizing that the microscope had done more than reveal the organism. It had distilled her life into observation, catalogued her as a specimen of fear and disease, and rendered her entirely subject to the judgment of authorities. She turned away from the lenses, feeling the weight of the invisible organism mirrored in the eyes of the physicians and the walls themselves. Outside, London awaited, indifferent and patient. Inside, the microscope had revealed not merely a pathogen, but the full truth of her isolation, that knowledge, once gained, could not be unseen, and that in the city's measured eyes, she had already been categorized, observed, and contained. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, the candlelight flickering across her face. The microscope had exposed the secret her body could not hide, and in doing so, had illuminated the city's relentless, unfeeling vigilance. The organism was small, but its implications for her freedom, her family, and her life were immense and entirely unavoidable. Dr. Alistair Whitmore was a man whose footsteps had carried him far beyond the narrow, soot-streaked streets of Whitechapel. He had traversed continents, crossed seas swollen with winter storms, and observed diseases in the remotest reaches of the empire, from the humid ports of Calcutta to the arid deserts of the African hinterlands. Yet when he stood in the quiet chamber of the East London workhouse, examining Eleanor Price once more, the distance he had travelled seemed both vast and inconsequential. For all the breadth of his experience, he was confronted here with a truth as intimate and relentless as any he had encountered. The effect of disease upon the human soul, magnified within the confines of fear and isolation. The room smelled faintly of carbolic and candle smoke. A single lamp flickered against the grey walls, its light dancing across shelves of instruments and vials. Dr. Whitmore had positioned Eleanor in the centre of the chamber, her hands folded, her left hidden beneath her shawl. The numb patch that marked her existence seemed to him, in this dim glow, a focal point for every observation, every measurement, every caution he had learned to practice across continents. "Miss Price," he began, his voice low, measured, and steeped in the authority that came from decades of observation, "you must understand that the phenomena we observe here are not confined to London alone. The signs, the progression, the subtle absence of sensation, they appear in every corner of the empire where this affliction has manifested. It is the same in Calcutta, in Cape Town, in the ports of Hong Kong. The body carries its secrets in the same meticulous, indifferent way, and the human response, fear, avoidance, exile, is nearly universal." Eleanor shifted slightly, her eyes flicking to the faint shadows on the wall, the muted light giving the room a spectral quality. "So she," murmured, voice trembling, It is not only London that judges me. Dr. Whitmore's eyes softened, though the rest of his expression remained disciplined, almost impervious. Judgment is not unique to this city, nor is isolation. Where this disease appears, society reacts with similar caution, often guided by fear more than reason. It is human nature to withdraw from what it cannot understand, to protect through avoidance, even when it causes suffering. He gestured to the array of vials on the small table beside him. Each one contained a record of study, a fragment of the knowledge he had gathered across continents. In India, I observed entire households quarantined silently, their doors barred, their meals delivered through small slits. In Africa, entire communities were subjected to similar scrutiny, their lives measured by proximity, touch, and rumor. The disease is slow, insidious, almost imperceptible at first, and yet the consequences extend far beyond the body. Eleanor's gaze fell upon her own hands. The left, numb and pale, was a silent testament to her condition. The right, still responsive, rested tightly in her lap. "And here?" she asked softly. "Here in London, will it be the same?" Dr. Whitmore's gaze met hers with a steadiness that carried the weight of his travels. "Perhaps worse. The city is crowded, the streets narrow, the eyes of neighbors unrelenting. Observation is constant. Every gesture, every movement, every reaction is noted, catalogued, and interpreted, and fear travels faster than any disease. You will be watched, Miss Price, as rigorously as you have ever been examined, but the isolation you endure will be magnified by the vigilance of the city itself." Eleanor pressed her lips together, the words settling over her like frost on glass. The extent of the empire, the far reaches he had seen, seemed almost irrelevant in the face of London's relentless scrutiny. The city had learned, in its own methodical, merciless way, to contain her not with chains or walls, but with the subtle architecture of fear, distance, and observation. Dr. Whitmore adjusted a vial, the metallic clink echoing faintly. "I have travelled far," he said, softer now, almost to himself, "and I have seen the world's response to this affliction. Yet no distance, no culture, no system of governance changes the human instinct to fear what it cannot touch, to separate what it cannot control. Here, Miss Price, the Empire and London converge. The disease is the same, but the judgment is uniquely precise, cold, and unyielding." Eleanor lowered her gaze, folding her hands over the numb patch, feeling the invisible weight of centuries of human reaction pressing down on her. The empire might stretch far beyond the horizon, but London, with its fog, its gas lamps, and its silent scrutiny, felt limitless, a city whose vigilance could measure her body, her hand, and her very existence with a precision that no distant shore had ever required. Within the chambers of the East London Contagion Board, thick walls insulated discourse from the world outside. Gas lamps hung suspended in their wrought-iron cages, casting weak, oscillating light upon polished oak tables, where documents, ledgers, and official correspondence lay in deliberate disorder. The air smelled of ink, carbolic, and the faint, lingering odor of burnt candle wicks, a scent that clung to every corner like the ghosts of decisions past. Behind closed doors, the city's authority convened to deliberate, weigh, and codify the response to the invisible terror that had begun to mark its inhabitants. Eleanor's name was not spoken within these halls, yet it was present in every ledger, every notation, every hushed murmur. Physicians, inspectors, and bureaucrats leaned over the polished tables, their expressions tight with concentration. Each voice carried weight, each word calculated, each pause pregnant with consequence. Outside, London's streets murmured with fog and frost, unaware of the meticulous machinery operating above it, yet subtly governed by its outcomes. "Miss Price's case is significant," said one official, his voice low and deliberate, though he avoided direct eye contact with his colleagues. The patch of numbness and loss of sensation aligns with early-stage affliction. We cannot allow her to remain unobserved within the city. Another, younger but equally austere, tapped a pen against the polished wood. True, yet the ward capacity is strained, and there is the matter of family and social stability. Do we remove her immediately, or extend observation within the workhouse until further confirmation? A third interjected, voice measured yet heavy with impatience. Observation alone does not prevent spread. London's populace is sensitive to rumours. Already, neighbours whisper, avoid, and isolate. Inaction invites panic, and panic is contagious in ways the disease itself cannot achieve. The debate stretched on, each official presenting scenarios, precedents, and statistics. They spoke in detached tones, yet beneath the civility, the tension was palpable. Every decision carried weight beyond paper. Each directive would ripple outward, reaching tenements, alleyways, and the trembling households of Whitechapel. Their deliberations were conducted as if balancing not only facts and evidence but the fragile lives tethered to the board's pronouncements. One older physician, spectacles perched precariously on his nose, leaned forward, voice lowered. We must consider the human element. Removal is necessary for containment, yes, but it is also a form of exile. A household may fracture. Families may be driven to despair. We document cases, yes, yet we do not account for the silent suffering that follows. Another struck the table lightly with his fist, emphasizing precision over compassion. The human element cannot outweigh public safety. London is crowded, teeming with those who cannot discern threat from rumor. Precaution, in this case, must be absolute. Observation, while humane in theory, invites error. We cannot risk contagion for sentiment. The room grew quieter as the officials considered their words, each aware of the stakes, yet constrained by duty and the weight of protocol. Outside, the fog pressed against the board's high windows, muffling the city's morning stir. Inside, the debate carved invisible lines, measured outcomes, and delineated the boundaries of mercy and control. Finally, the lead official, a man whose expression carried the gravitas of years spent adjudicating crises, cleared his throat. We shall proceed with formal removal under controlled supervision. Observation alone is insufficient. Documentation must be precise and compliance enforced. The household and the city will adjust accordingly. The board's authority is absolute. The room exhaled, though not in relief. Each individual returned to their papers, pens scratching, instruments realigned, and the machinery of governance resumed its quiet, meticulous rhythm. Eleanor, though absent from the chamber, existed in every decision, every judgment, every measure enacted behind these walls. London continued outside, indifferent, yet bound inexorably to the determinations made within the chamber. And in the quiet of the tenements, the fog-shrouded streets, and the frost-laden alleys, Eleanor's life, her freedom, her household, her very existence was already being reshaped by decisions that had never included her voice. The debate behind closed doors had concluded, but its consequences would echo endlessly, shaping the city, the ward, and every hesitant step she took thereafter. The fog had not lifted when she returned, and Eleanor caught the faintest glimpse of her own shadow as she stepped from the carriage onto the cobblestones of Whitechapel. London had not changed the narrow streets, gas lamps flickering against the damp walls, and the subtle tang of coal smoke clinging to every doorway remained familiar, yet everything was irrevocably altered. Where once neighbours had exchanged cursory greetings, now they leaned behind curtains, or peered through cracked shutters with eyes sharp and suspicious. Eleanor understood at once that her return was more than physical. It carried the weight of rumour, fear, and expectation. Her first steps along the fogged streets were tentative, the fabric of her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She noted the gaps in the usual pedestrian flow, a path carefully measured by avoidance. Children, who had once played heedless of consequence, skirted the edges of the alleys, glancing back as though uncertain of what they might see. Merchants in the small shops adjusted their wares, a subtle pivot of basket or parchment, to create an invisible buffer. Eleanor walked past them all, aware that every movement was scrutinized, every gesture catalogued, every glance weighed. The carriage had deposited her at the edge of the neighborhood, a strategic point where the board's authority intersected with the vigilance of the city. Beyond the cobbled streets, the fog obscured the familiar skyline of chimneys and church steeples. Eleanor paused, inhaling the cold air, tasting the faint tang of soot and frost. She felt simultaneously liberated and condemned, free to move, yet constrained by the invisible parameters set by those who had watched, measured, and determined her worth. The ward, the board, the inspections they had, altered her in ways subtle yet irrevocable. Her left hand remained pale and numb, a mark that the city would notice long before she spoke, long before she could explain. Yet it was more than the physical symptom that carried consequence. It was the shadow of isolation, the expectation of avoidance, the whispered acknowledgement of fear that had followed her since her removal. Each step forward was measured not by her will, but by the city's readiness to accept her presence. As Eleanor approached her former home, she noticed the small changes that spoke louder than words. The shuttered windows, the door with a faint new seal, the absence of a single familiar neighbor along the way. Mara, her sister, awaited her cautiously, wrapped in a shawl, eyes wide, both eager and fearful. When Eleanor stepped onto the threshold, Mara's hands trembled, neither fully extending in welcome nor retreating in hesitation. The embrace they shared was brief, careful, measured. Words felt fragile, their meaning contingent on proximity and perception. Inside, the tenement was the same in structure, yet different in atmosphere. The hearth, once warm and alive, seemed cold and uncertain. The furniture retained its shape but not its comfort. Every corner was now an invitation to observation. Eleanor placed her shawl aside and set her gaze on the objects she had left behind the mantel. The small mirror, the faint scent of lavender that clung to the wooden surfaces. She realized that in her absence, the house had adapted to fear just as the city had. The portrait removed, the floors swept clean, the walls attuned to the quiet pulse of avoidance. For Eleanor, the return was bittersweet. She was home, yet the home itself had shifted in her absence, reshaped by the silent verdict of a society that measured life in steps, glances, and unspoken judgment. Outside, London exhaled its fog across the rooftops, indifferent to her presence, yet deeply aware of her history, her condition, and the latent tension she carried. Eleanor understood, with a sharp clarity, that her life in the city would never again follow the rhythm of ordinary days. She had returned to London, yes, but she had returned to a city that had learned to divide, to isolate, and to measure her existence with the cold precision of fear. And in that realization, she felt both relief and dread, bound together in the slow, deliberate cadence of a city that observed as much as it lived. In the dim, lamp-lit study of the contagion board, a single photograph lay atop a polished wooden desk, its edges curling slightly from the damp London air. Eleanor had not seen it yet, but Dr. Whitmore gestured toward it with deliberate care, as though the glassy image might shatter under too casual an observation. The room smelled faintly of ink, carbolic, and paper pressed with authority. The air was thick with the weight of precedent and meticulous documentation. The photograph, in all its stark clarity, was meant to capture her condition, the numb patch on her left hand, pale and still, illuminated beneath the harsh glare of a laboratory lamp. Dr. Whitmore adjusted the small lamp above it, casting its light evenly across the image. "This," he said softly, almost reverently, will serve as the record in the medical journal. It is evidence of the early presentation of the affliction, and it will be circulated among the physicians of the board and affiliated institutions. His gloved hands hovered over the photograph, careful not to smudge or displace it. It is precise, clinical, and essential. Eleanor studied the photograph, though she could not move closer. The image was unsettling her hand, frozen in color and light, rendered both intimate and anonymous, the very symbol of her isolation. To the physicians who would study it, she was both known and unknown, a specimen for observation rather than a person whose life was being quietly unraveled. Each line, each shadow, each minute detail was preserved, catalogued, and interpreted. The photograph made her existence tangible to strangers, and yet it stripped away the context, the warmth, and the small truths of daily life that had once defined her. This photograph, Dr. Whitmore continued, will accompany detailed notes on sensation, or rather, the absence of it. Every prick, every test, every observation, it will all be referenced here. It is meant to ensure consistency and to guide intervention. It is not for judgment, yet it will shape perception. That is the nature of documentation. Eleanor felt a cold tightening in her chest. She understood that the image did not merely capture her body, it captured her presence as an object of scrutiny. Each physician who viewed it would see the disease, the absence of sensation, the pale patch, but few would see her fear, her resilience, or the complex web of human emotion that threaded through her every movement. In the sterile clarity of the photograph, she was reduced to a single fact, a visible marker of affliction, a point of study, a cautionary illustration. Her gaze lingered on the photograph, and she realized that it would travel further than her footsteps could reach, beyond the fog-bound streets of Whitechapel, past the tenements that had once contained her life. Doctors in distant offices, students in lecture halls, and administrators in offices far removed from the ward would examine it, annotate it, and use it to inform policies and practices. Her condition, private and intimate, had been transformed into an instrument of public knowledge, a truth laid bare for the empire to measure and respond to. Dr. Whitmore closed the journal with a soft click, his hands meticulous, his expression unreadable. "It is done," he said, though the words felt hollow, even to him. The photograph, now catalogued, would exist in perpetuity as evidence, devoid of context, devoid of mercy, preserved in the annals of science and bureaucracy. Eleanor stepped back from the desk, the weight of the photograph pressing upon her mind more than any instrument or examination ever could. Outside, London moved with its usual indifference, the fog curling around chimneys and lampposts, the sounds of carts and voices muffled beneath its grey embrace. Yet, inside the study, in the frozen light of that single lamp, Eleanor understood fully the power of the photograph. It had captured not only the pale patch on her hand, but the beginning of her erasure, the codification of her existence as an object of fear, and the city's meticulous vigilance rendered in ink, glass, and shadow. The hospital gates, wrought iron and polished to a dull gleam, had never seemed welcoming to Eleanor. For weeks she had observed them from a distance, their spires and archways looming above the fog-bound streets of Whitechapel, a sentinel of authority and containment. Yet on the morning she was escorted through them once more, the gates swung wide, the hinges releasing a low metallic groan that echoed into the grey streets, as if London itself exhaled in anticipation. The opening was not an act of mercy, but of calculated provision. The ward's capacity had been exceeded, and the board deemed it necessary to expand access while retaining control. Eleanor's carriage rolled through the gates, wheels crunching against frost-hardened gravel. She leaned forward slightly, peering through the narrow window, seeing the courtyard spread out before her like a measured landscape. Rows of newly prepared beds, neatly aligned, glimmered faintly under the early sunlight that struggled through the London fog. Nurses moved among them, their steps careful, gloved hands adjusting blankets, linen, and trays. Every motion was deliberate, measured for efficiency, as though the ward had become a machine, its components, staff and patients alike, operating under the unseen authority of the board. As Eleanor disembarked, Matron Hargrove waited, her expression as unyielding as ever. She guided Eleanor through the hallways, past doors labelled for observation, quarantine, and treatment, each one a reminder that this was a place where precision, order, and vigilance defined existence more than comfort, warmth, or human affection. The smell of carbolic and disinfectant was sharper here, pressed into every corner, mixing with the faint, metallic tang of instruments that gleamed in narrow cabinets along the walls. The new ward was spacious yet austere, its rows of beds aligned with meticulous care. Each mattress was thin but firm, each pillow fluffed with the exact measure of softness deemed appropriate by staff. Curtains hung between beds, a fragile attempt at privacy that did little to alleviate the pervasive sense of observation. Eleanor was guided to a bed near the centre, where the light of a nearby lamp caught the pale patch on her hand through the folds of her shawl. She settled onto the edge, folding her hands carefully in her lap, acutely aware that every movement would be noted. Dr. Whitmore approached, notebook in hand, his expression measured. The expansion allows us to accommodate more patients and to provide care under controlled observation, he said, his tone precise, almost ceremonial. You will have your routines maintained, your meals delivered, and your evaluations continued as previously scheduled. The city's vigilance remains now extended to this expanded space. Eleanor's eyes traced the rows of beds, noting the slight tremors of those already present, the subtle fear that moved through the air as palpably as the antiseptic scent. Though the gates had opened, she understood that the freedom they offered was illusory. The ward was larger, yet every inch was still measured, controlled, and observed. The expansion did not bring warmth. It brought more eyes, more scrutiny, and the subtle, unyielding pressure of London's authority. She drew a slow breath, pressing the numb patch against her chest, feeling the cold persistence of it beneath her shawl. Outside, the fog swirled along the streets, indifferent to the expansion, indifferent to the patients now under careful surveillance. Within, Eleanor understood fully that the opening of the hospital gates was not an act of compassion, but a further assertion of control, a city extending its reach into the lives of those it feared, measured and contained with clinical precision. As the matron and physician moved away to attend to other preparations, Eleanor leaned back, eyes fixed on the pale light glimmering across the new beds. She understood that even in this expanded ward, the mechanisms of observation and isolation were unbroken. The gates had opened, but the city's vigilance remained, a quiet, inescapable presence, shaping every step, every glance, every heartbeat within the hospital's walls. The small laboratory adjoining the ward smelled of carbolic and ink, a mixture that clawed at the throat and reminded every visitor of the precision required in observation. Eleanor was led there by Dr. Whitmore, the faint shuffle of her slippers against the polished floor echoing through the narrow space. Within, a young researcher worked over a microscope, hands trembling ever so slightly, as though the weight of the empire, the disease, and the lives catalogued within these walls pressed upon them all at once. The researcher, thin and pale, with dark circles beneath keen eyes, paused when Eleanor entered. A bead of sweat slid down the temple, catching the flickering light of a nearby lamp. His hands, gloved in white, shook as he adjusted the focus on the instrument, testing samples of tissue and fluid with meticulous care. Eleanor sensed immediately that these tremors were not from fatigue alone, but from the knowledge that each observation carried consequences beyond the laboratory. For her, for the city, and for every family whispered about in the streets of Whitechapel. Dr. Whitmore spoke quietly, directing Eleanor to a chair near the bench. "Observe carefully," he murmured, though his words seemed more directed at the researcher than at Eleanor herself. "Accuracy is essential. Every observation may inform policy, may determine the course of treatment, and may influence decisions regarding containment. We cannot allow error." The young man nodded, his fingers hovering over a glass slide, the tremor in his hand magnified as he lifted it to the microscope. Eleanor's eyes followed the motion, noting the meticulous care with which he adjusted the instrument, the precision of each movement. The laboratory, small and crowded with instruments, smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold metal, a scent that pressed into the lungs like a warning. Through the microscope, he observed the tissue, noting the subtle changes that defined the early stages of the affliction. Pale patches, diminished sensation, and the quiet, insidious signs invisible to the untrained eye. His pen hovered over a small notebook, jotting meticulous notes with delicate, deliberate strokes. Each line of ink was a record, a testament, and a verdict. Eleanor's hand rested lightly on the edge of her shawl, hiding the pale, numb patch beneath. She could feel its presence, a silent echo of the organism the researcher was scrutinizing, yet she knew that the microscope and the ink had more authority than her own perception. For the first time, Eleanor felt the full weight of observation not merely from the physician or matron, but from the fragile hands of someone whose responsibility carried the authority of the empire. The researcher's tremors, small and human, revealed a tension that mirrored her own. The knowledge that every action, every mark, every recorded detail might shape her life irreversibly. The laboratory was both sanctuary and tribunal, a place where science and fear collided, where the meticulous care of hands could both preserve and condemn. Dr. Whitmore spoke again, softly, instructing the researcher on the next sample, his tone precise, careful, but carrying the weight of inevitability. Eleanor watched the interaction, the tremors in the young man's hands reflecting the unspoken anxiety that permeated the ward and the city beyond. She realized that observation alone was a form of control that in these careful records, in these precise notes, her body, her hand, and her existence had already been measured, catalogued, and partially contained. When the session ended, the researcher leaned back, gloved hands pressed briefly to his forehead, and exhaled with a relief that was as small as it was fleeting. Eleanor remained seated, feeling the numbness in her hand echo the tremor she had witnessed, understanding that the careful study of life and illness had its own violence, one not of malice, but of precision, scrutiny, and inescapable observation. In the flickering lamplight, she recognized the truth. London's vigilance extended far beyond the streets, the wards, and the inspectors. It lived in every hand that recorded, every eye that observed, and every inked line that defined her existence. Evening arrived like a slow, deliberate exhalation, pressing itself through the frosted windows of the East London Auxiliary Workhouse. The gas lamps outside flickered through the fog, casting pale, wavering light upon streets emptied by fear and prudence. Inside, the ward seemed to shrink under the gathering darkness, its long corridors swallowing sound, and the beds aligned in their meticulous rows became islands of shadow. Eleanor sat upon the edge of her bed, shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, hands folded in her lap. The numb patch concealed yet acutely present, a quiet reminder of her difference, her isolation, and the relentless observation she endured. The day had passed with the same careful cadence as all others, inspections, examinations, and quiet compliance. The matron had moved through the ward with her usual precision, keys jangling softly, her gaze as unwavering as the gaslight, ensuring every bed was in order, every patient accounted for. Nurses delivered meals, adjusted blankets, and noted minor variations in behavior. their gloved hands moving like shadows themselves. Yet with the evening's descent, the ward assumed a new, almost tangible stillness, as if the day's measured activity had been absorbed into the walls and the air itself. Eleanor listened to the silence, noting its shape and weight. It was not the absence of sound she had grown accustomed to. It was deeper, heavier, an almost physical presence that pressed against the ribs and shoulders. The faint creak of floorboards, the distant shuffle of a nurse's slippers, and the occasional cough were absorbed and dampened, swallowed by the ambient hush. Even whispers between patients had become muted, hesitant, as if the darkness demanded restraint. The ward, Eleanor realized, had learned to hold its breath along with its inhabitants. A candle flickered near her bed, throwing long shadows across the walls. She traced the elongated outlines of chairs, instruments, and curtains, noticing the small movements of the shadows themselves, which seemed to sway with their own awareness. The faint scent of carbolic lingered in the corners, sharp and sterile, yet softened by the subtle warmth of the candle's flame. Every detail of the ward was amplified in the evening light. The precise folds of blankets, the gleam of metal instruments, the quiet tension in every posture. Eleanor thought of the other patients, of the children and adults whose lives had been suspended here. Their breaths, shallow and rhythmic, contributed to the collective stillness. Each movement was calculated, each sound restrained. A boy in the far corner shifted slightly beneath his blanket. A woman adjusted her shawl. The faintest shuffle of fabric echoed through the chamber, like the passage of time itself. In that silence, Eleanor felt the weight of shared apprehension, the communal consciousness of those marked by fear and observation. Outside the frosted windows, London moved indifferently beneath its cloak of fog. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, footsteps traced patterns in the mist, and lamps flickered along deserted streets. Yet within the ward, the world had contracted to the span of the room, the edges of the bed, and the pale hands hidden beneath shawls. The evening's silence was not merely absence. It was a force, a tangible measure of isolation, a testimony to the city's vigilance and the workhouse's control. Eleanor pressed her forehead lightly against the back of her hands, her pulse echoing in the quiet chamber. She understood that this silence was both protection and punishment, a fragile boundary between observation and oppression. The ward had fallen silent not because it was empty or calm, but because it had learned to hold its breath, to mirror the stillness of the city itself, a city that measured life, fear, and presence with meticulous precision. And in that stillness, Eleanor realized the truth she had been anticipating since her arrival. The ward's silence was not passive. It was deliberate, deliberate as the city itself, a measured, unyielding presence, waiting, watching, and ensuring that even the smallest whisper, the faintest movement, and the lightest footstep were held under the weight of observation. Tonight, the ward fell silent, and Eleanor, like the city, remained within its careful, merciless gaze. The fog had descended early that evening, curling along the streets of Whitechapel like a living thing. Its tendrils wound around lampposts, slithered between alleyways, and pressed against the faces of those few brave enough to traverse the frost-hardened cobblestones. The city appeared diminished beneath the mist, sounds muted, forms blurred, as though the very world had been reduced to shapes and whispers. Yet within the veil of fog, Eleanor sensed a strange clarity, a quiet dominion in which London's judgment moved unseen but absolute, carrying no rumours, no gossip, no human voice, only the cold weight of observation. From her vantage at the frosted window of the workhouse, Eleanor watched the dim glow of gas lamps flicker uncertainly. Carriages rolled slowly, wheels crunching faintly on stone, their drivers cautious, measuring each turn and curve. The fog, thick and unrelenting, seemed to draw a curtain across the city, hiding lives, compressing streets, and amplifying the presence of fear. Eleanor's hand, the left one numb and pale, rested against the sill beneath her shawl. She felt the chill of it, but it was the fog itself that pressed most insistently, a tangible silence that seemed to mark her as much as her affliction. No footsteps approached the building. No voices echoed along the alleyways. Even the hawkers' calls were absorbed into the dense grey, leaving only the occasional scrape of a cartwheel or the faint hiss of a horse's breath in the cold air. London, in all its vastness, had become a city of muted presence, its usual chaos replaced by a deliberate, encompassing quiet. It was a quiet that spoke more than the harshest gossip ever could, a quiet that measured, observed, and dictated conduct without uttering a single word. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the other windows of the ward. Shadows of patients shifted beneath blankets, fingers tracing the folds of cloth, eyes fixed upon the dimly illuminated streets. All were aware of the fog, its concealment, and its impartiality. For in the mist there was no human voice to judge, yet judgment prevailed, unspoken, through distance, obscurity, and the intangible weight of anticipation. She recalled the letter returned unopened, the photograph in the medical journal, the careful notes of Dr. Whitmore, and the trembling hands of the researcher. Each action, each record, each observation had travelled far beyond the confines of this room, and yet the fog carried no rumour, no voice to amplify these truths. The city itself had absorbed them, folding them into its fabric, leaving Eleanor to confront the silence that was now her constant companion. Outside, the gas lamps bent against the wind, casting uncertain light across the glistening streets. The fog carried no whispers, yet it seemed to know every secret, every truth, every mark of fear that London had learned to recognize. The streets were empty, yet the emptiness was not benign. It was a lattice of invisible boundaries, demarcating who might walk freely and who must tread carefully, measured by the city's omnipresent, patient vigilance. Eleanor pressed her forehead lightly to the window pane, the cold glass biting her skin. She understood then that the fog was not mere weather. It was a sentinel, a mediator, a conduit of the city's silent authority. The streets, the alleys, the buildings, all moved in accordance with an unspoken law, and in this law she was both observed and contained. As darkness deepened, the fog thickened, swallowing the weak glimmer of lamps and the faint shuffle of unseen pedestrians. Eleanor drew the shawl tighter, resting her hands over the numb patch, feeling the quiet press against her as intimately as her own pulse. London had exhaled its judgment, and in the fog that carried no rumours, she understood the city's vigilance was absolute, impartial, indifferent, and inescapable. By the time Eleanor had endured the cycles of examinations, isolation, and observation, London had become a city both familiar and alien, its streets, alleys, and tenements rewritten in the language of fear. The fog lingered perpetually, curling through corners and pressing against window panes like the city's silent memory. It carried no rumours now, only the persistent presence of vigilance, ensuring that every footstep, every glance, every gesture was measured against the standard of precaution. Eleanor, her left hand still pale and numb, understood at last that the city's horror was not in fire, plague, or public uproar, but in the quiet, meticulous processes that marked, catalogued, and contained life. She sat at the edge of her bed in the ward, the candlelight flickering against walls grey with damp and age. Outside, the fog rolled through Whitechapel, muting the distant cries of children, the rattle of carts, and the occasional cough that escaped from a shuttered doorway. Each sound seemed amplified within the ward, stretching into the silence, reminding Eleanor that every note, every echo, was part of the city's careful observation. London did not act with haste or violence. It acted with patience, precision, and quiet inevitability. Her thoughts returned to the photograph in the medical journal. the microscope revealing the hidden organism beneath her skin, the researcher's trembling hands, and the meticulous notes recorded with ink and authority. Each act of observation had constructed a lattice around her life, a framework of scrutiny from which she could not escape. She had become simultaneously present and absent, a subject of study, a figure of fear, a fragment of a city that had learned to measure the human body as diligently as it measured rumor and reputation. The workhouse itself had grown in her mind into something more than a building. It was a threshold, a liminal space where the ordinary flow of life ceased, where every interaction was dictated by the delicate calculus of compliance and oversight. Matron Hargrove's relentless watch, Dr. Whitmore's methodical tests, and the board's distant deliberations had all converged to define Eleanor not merely as a patient, but as a symbol, the embodiment of the city's anxiety, the tangible proof of its vigilance. She thought of her family, of her sister Mara, and of the household that had been fractured by fear. The return to her tenement had offered little solace. The shutters remained drawn, the mantel bare, the furniture arranged with careful deliberation, as though to mark absence as firmly as presence. Even those who had once been closest to her had learned to measure distance, to avoid touch, to preserve themselves against the intangible contagion of dread. London's horror was as much social and emotional as it was medical. The isolation, the avoidance, the subtle shifts in posture and gaze that conveyed judgment without words. Eleanor pressed her remaining hand to the edge of the bed, feeling the faint tremor in her pulse, the persistent numbness beneath her shawl, and the weight of a city's vigilance pressing in from every side. She understood fully that the horror London had inflicted was not something to be confronted directly. It was woven into the fabric of the streets, the tenements, and the fog. It had been cultivated slowly, patiently, and meticulously, until fear became instinct, vigilance became habit, and every resident, even those unaware of her condition, had internalized its presence. As the candle guttered, casting quivering shadows across the walls, Eleanor realized that London's horror would endure long after her body had recovered or succumbed. It was inscribed into the rhythm of the city, the cadence of its streets, and the quiet, inescapable knowledge that the populace could measure, judge, and isolate with a precision that no instrument, no physician, no law could surpass. And so Eleanor sat in the flickering lamplight, the fog pressing against the high windows, the wards silent around her, and understood the unalterable truth. The horror that London inflicted was not merely a disease, not merely a moment of terror, but a lasting architecture of fear, a memory etched into the city itself, and it would never be forgotten.